by there about 2 weeks ago for shopping.
I want to start by thanking everyone for being here this afternoon.
Coming out.
It's fantastic, and I also want to add my special thanks to the members of the task force who have agreed to help us figure out the right way forward here. And I want to thank all the engineers and architects and Museum Center Music Hall personnel for coming together. I want to remind you where we've been. It was just before the holidays when Tim and Kathy of the Greater Cincinnati Foundation and Hale Foundation asked me if I would try to assemble a task force and chair that task force to take a look at what do we need to do about our cultural facilities in Cincinnati and come up with a path forward. We were asked to be objective, look at all the options, and come back with a proposal that the community could support. So I want to thank everyone who's agreed to be here, who's participated, because it's been a great exercise. You may recall we met January 13th and 14th for 2 days. We took a tour of the building. It was quite a long tour. I want to thank Steve for that, for the 4-hour tour of the building. And since then, we've also met with Steve Leeper of 3CDC, and Steve will be with us here in a few minutes to talk about the progress that we've had at Music Hall. The one thing I'd like to encourage everybody is to maintain the confidentiality of what goes on in this room. We're going to be sharing a lot of numbers, a lot of project scope and various things that the news media would love to have. And we don't want that news media to become news before we've agreed as a task force the right way forward. There's been some publicity already, and we're trying to control that publicity so that the results of the task force work can be fully baked before it becomes public knowledge. So please be on the lookout for people around the building who may be with the media or outside the building, or if you might get phone calls or letters, we would encourage you just to send them my way or Elizabeth's way or Beth's way. Is Beth here? Yes, here. I'm sorry, there's Beth. Beth, raise your hand. Beth is the, we call it external relations at P&G. I'm not sure what you call it, the Hale Foundation or at the Greater Cincinnati Foundation, but Beth is the media contact for the Greater Cincinnati Foundation, so we're funneling all media requests through Beth. Beth is the point of contact for that. Let me then talk about where we started. We started this exercise for the Museum Center using the master plan of the Museum Center. Now, as all of us in business know, good businesses have master plans. Master plans are kind of dream lists or wish lists. They aren't necessarily something you actually do, but every good organization has a plan over a 5, 10, 20, 25-year period so that when you go somewhere, you know that the direction you're going. And we started with this master plan. The master plan was put together by a design team, and what we as a task force did, we hired an evaluation team. The evaluation team works for the task force. The design team works for the Museum Center. But since January 13th and 14th, we've come together as a collaborative group, the design team, the evaluation team, to see what parts of the master plan should be in scope, what parts might not be in scope, how could we value engineer the master plan to a level that may be more affordable for the community. So the original numbers that were shared with some of the county commissioners were this $301 to $394 million number, but frankly that was a number for the entire master plan over a long period of time and was never thought that that was affordable even at the time it was shared. Nevertheless, the master plan gave us a place to start as we began our work. Any questions or comments over anything I've covered? If not, I'll turn it over to Scott Rowland, the Senior Project Manager for Langen Engineering, who's led the evaluation team over the last, 3 weeks or 4 weeks since we started this process. Scott?
Hi, everyone. I wanted to thank everyone for allowing us to be part of this important process and to help you in deciding how to move forward with this project. Before I get started, I just wanted to introduce to you the people that are going to be presenting today. Steve Kennett from GBBN is also part of the evaluation team. He's an architecture firm here in Cincinnati. Matt Verst is one of the members of Messer who's going to be presenting the cost estimates that were prepared. And Vic Gerhardt is also going to be participating in the presentation of the cost estimates from Turner. Bill Judd is going to be our structural engineer presenting the structural aspects of the project. And we have Brian Arbogast, who's going to be presenting the mechanical, electrical, and plumbing aspects of the project. In addition, we have Dan Lugerine and Samantha Bailey, who were integral in putting together the presentation and helping us pull all these photos and images together in a way that we can present to you today. We also have Chris Westbrook, who manages our Akron office, and Bill Sandersky, who's also helped support this process, that's one of the structural engineers, and Spencer Johnson from GBBN. So when Bob approached us, he asked us to evaluate this problem that Cincinnati has. We're trying to figure out how to move forward with their Cincinnati Museum Center. And some of the options that he had us evaluate were invest in the existing building, relocate museum to new facilities, or remain status quo for the time being. So throughout the past 2 weeks, 3 weeks, we've evaluated these options, and today we're going to be presenting these to you and making a recommendation to the task force on which option we think should be moved forward with. So most of you were here last week for the orientation meetings, and we're not going to dive into detail of everything that was discussed during those orientation meetings, but I still wanted to set a baseline of what this cost estimate was based off of. So in 2007, the design team that was put together by George Skarmeus, who you met last week, and his design team put together a master plan. We used that as the basis of the cost estimate, along with the presentations given during the first 2 days of the orientation meetings, along with all these other documents that were put together both by the design team and the evaluation team over the past couple weeks.
Scott, we should say too that if any task force member has any questions or comments as we go, please jump in at any point.
Absolutely. I always feel like this is a better presentation if it's an open conversation about our thoughts on this process, and any questions that you have throughout, please feel free to chime in. So I'm going to hit on a couple bullet points of items I took away from the first 2 days of the orientation meetings, and really I walked away with the understanding from the architectural and design team of where the baseline was for this project. So in 1990, work was done to bring the museum center here to Union Terminal. The key is that was not a full renovation of this space. In fact, at that time, there was a plan that was put in place for full renovation, but that was eliminated from the project, the reduced costs at the time. Since that time, I think a lot of us have realized that the museum center, it's been a success here in this building, and the three museums operate very well under this building, and it's been a success. So now they're looking at expanding on that success by allowing the museum center to grow for the next 80 years in this building. So that's where the master plan comes into play. So project one was done, which on your tour you saw, and really the goal of the master plan calls for a full restoration of the historic spaces to the standards of project one. But one of the key things to understand is even though this is a historic building and there are historic spaces, the percentage of historic spaces are actually rather low compared to traditional historic buildings. And actually only 20% of the entire building is considered historic. This room you're sitting in is considered historic, but a lot of spaces are not. And the reason for that is because those spaces were utilized for cars and parking. They're utilized for baggage handling. They're utilized for the functioning of the train station beneath the building. So those spaces have actually lent to a very good building for museum space, because museum space operates well in a black box environment where there's no windows that to the outside, where the lighting can be controlled by the museum versus having to deal with the windows and the lighting coming in from the outside. So the structural aspects I took away from the first couple days of the orientation meetings are the structural frame of the building is good. In fact, Nancy from Silman and Associates, a very well-renowned national structural engineering firm that I've done work with in the past, has said if we do the proper restoration of this building could last forever if it's properly maintained over time. And that's really something important to understand, because when you're looking at the building and we're going through this process, I mean, we're talking about facade that's falling down, and we're talking about other aspects of the building that are not in good condition, like water leaking in through the roofs. But the thing to understand is the structure behind this building is in good condition. And you can see here, the reason for that is the builders of this building were railroad engineers, and they built this building like a bridge, and you can see the steel structure in here, and it's sound from what we've seen. The things that do need to be fixed is the envelope is actually in very poor condition. So poor, in fact, that Nancy from Silman, along with our structural engineers, took a look at it and said, you know what, there's immediate fixes that need to happen right now in order to make sure the safety of the museum and its patrons are maintained. Some of these safety elements are like right here. This is this structural skin of the wall, and you can see that it's deteriorating over time. And there's many examples of that throughout the building that Nancy saw for the first time, where when she was here in 2006, 2007 preparing the master plan, these weren't elements that she noticed. And over those past 6-7 years, they've come about. So if we kick the can down the road on this project, more of these elements will pop up over time. On top of that, one element of the master plan that's discussed is removing all the flat roofs and replacing those flat roofs because there's water infiltration coming in through the building. Obviously, that's kind of a baseline. If we're going to move forward with this project, you don't want water infiltrating into your building, so those roofs need to be replaced in order to remove that situation. Finally, the last element that was discussed in depth was the infrastructure of this building. And one of the things that was discussed is the mechanical systems have exceeded their life expectancy. Most of these mechanical systems were built in the 1990s, so they're almost 25 years old. The master plan and the design team are calling for a full removal and replacement and relocation of these mechanical systems. One thing to note is the mechanical systems currently operate under inefficiency, not only due to their age, but also due to the fact that they were originally built as 3 separate systems to handle three museums. In the meantime, the Children's Museum has been added. Those systems, all 3 systems are pulled for the Children's Museum. There's also spaces like office space that operate under the same climate as the OmniMax Theater. So in order to allow and provide for flexibility in the future, these mechanical systems need to be addressed and become more flexible for the museum. And finally, the lighting systems have become obsolete. The master plan and design team are calling for a full replacement of the lighting systems to LED design to increase energy efficiency going forward.
Scott, on the slide, the far side, there was a bullet point on slab settlement. Would you touch on that?
Yes.
A couple seconds on that?
Sure. So I'll hit on this on the geotechnical
Scott,
portion later.
Repeat the question because...
Sure, I'm sorry, John. The question is one of the bullet points which states slab on grade settlement is occurring. That wasn't addressed. So currently there's both interior and exterior concrete slabs on grade that are settling over time. These slabs are separate from the building structure. The building structure is on wood piles, but these slabs are sitting on grade. And these slabs are most likely settling because there was 30 feet of fill placed on this site as part of this project. Between the compressible layer of soil, which we'll look at later in the presentation, and the fact that the soil probably was not properly compacted back in the day, these slabs are settling over time. That's something that does need to be addressed as part of the renovation, is the removal of these slabs and the compaction of the soil and the replacement of the slabs to properly mitigate that settlement. So I think I hit on infrastructure. So now we're going to talk about the construction costs. Vic and Matt are both going to come up here to discuss that. Before they get into the construction costs, I just want to say we met here last week and for 2 days, and ever since then we've been meeting with Messer and Turner and having multiple conference calls throughout the day, every single day since those orientation meetings. And Messer has been at Turner's office and Turner at Messer's office trying to come to an understanding of these cost estimates, and they've been working night and day through the weekends, through Martin Luther King's birthday to really get us a cost estimate that's relevant to this project and what we're looking at here.
So as Scott mentioned, the past 2 weeks have really been a collaborative effort between our teams, as well as the design team and the museum center themselves. It began 2 weeks ago at the orientation meeting, which many of you were a part of. From there, Turner and Messer met with the design team immediately following that to try to answer all of our scope questions that we had stemming from the master plan. We then each went back to perform our own independent estimates, but continuing to ask questions along the way and get great information back from the design team and the museum center. So it really was collaborative. After we completed our individual estimates, we came together to reconcile those estimates. And that included looking at the scope of the project, quantities we had arrived at, as well as pricing. During that process, it really required a lot of validation of the assumptions that each of our firms had made during our assembly of the estimates. And we were able to get validation of those assumptions by the design team and museum center. With the ultimate intent is really that we capture the scope of the project as it exists and make sure we have that scope captured in our numbers and, you know, not something in excess or leaving something out. So following that meeting, we each went back, we made updates to our estimate, and those are the numbers that you're going to see today. The pricing that we used really came from several sources. Messer, we certainly had knowledge of the facility from our work here previously during the 1990 renovation. We also had cost information and the experience from Project 1 that HGC performed and talked about last week. And then collectively between Turner and Messer, we also obviously have a large database of historical costs that both firms are able to bring together to help price this thing up. So, as I said, the process was highly collaborative, and it really did allow us to vet through the scope of the project with the design team. And I think the takeaway from that is that it got us to a place where I think the whole team was very confident in the numbers that we're going to present today. That was actually just a Messer project for them.
Just a Messer project? I guess everybody heard me. I was just asking if the 1990 project of Messer and Turner were, but he answered it. Thank you.
Yep. So
Matt, if I may, this is a little bit unprecedented, Bernadette, that to ask two archenemy competitors to work together, to collaborate. And I think all of us on the task force, and I know for me, I'd say great thanks to Matt and Vic for bringing the two companies together. This is really unprecedented. We've tried to reflect that in the slides. You'll notice some slides say Turner Messer and other slides say Messer Turner. And I count the number of times each day now I say one first and the other second because I want to be fair to both of them. who have shown tremendous collaboration. But on behalf of the community, I'm in awe by what you've done. So thank you in advance.
Absolutely. We came out of it without having any fist fights, so that was a plus. So we've kind of bucketed this estimate into some major scopes of work here that we're just going to touch on. Vic and I will talk through it and kind of let you know what scope of work falls under each of those categories. So we start out with the building envelope structural repair program. And that $27 million consists of replacing all of the flat roofs on the project, all of the masonry repairs that need to occur to the skin of the building, so tearing down parapets, repairing steel, building parapets back, tuck pointing of the building, complete cleaning of the building, including the brick and the limestone. It also includes repairs to the slab on grades that Scott was mentioning previously, as well as some of the structural slabs in the building. Complete caulking and cleaning of the building as well, as I mentioned. And again, any questions on the scope, feel free to ask.
Yeah, next, the building systems is primarily the heating and cooling system. It's a complete replacement of that system, complete replacement of the electrical and all the lighting in the building. Plumbing systems, all the piping is being replaced, and most of the fixtures as well. We also have all new fire suppression system throughout the building. And then finally an upgrade of the elevators and escalators, a restoration and renovation of those systems.
The interior architecture fit out and demo is pretty descriptive in itself. It consists of any of the interiors that we're going to touch in the facility. So in some cases, that's very minimal in certain spaces. In other spaces where programs are moving around or functions of the facility are moving around, that's a little more intensive. It's also includes restoration of the historical spaces, which, as Scott mentioned, is about 20% of the job or so, of the square footage of the building, as well as acoustical improvements that are going to occur. Some of these primarily in the rotunda itself. But for the most part, this is demolition of finishes, replacement of finishes like ceilings, walls, carpeting.
Then we have the fountain out in front. That is a total rebuild. It's a disassembling, rebuilding, restoration of that entire fountain with a new membrane because there's significant leaking going on with that fountain, so that'll be totally restored.
And the plaza apron deck, that's pretty similar to the fountain in that we're stripping that entire plaza down. And that's the portion that is from Dalton Street up to the face of the building. And currently that's concrete pavement, asphalt, pavers that are around the fountain. That's stripping all that down to the structural deck, re-waterproofing, and then building that back up. And that, again, and replacement of the expansion joints. And that's really to address those water infiltration issues that are occurring.
Then we have the Dalton Street repairs. There's significant deterioration of the roof deck itself and the light wells that penetrate that and get light into that tunnel. So the deck is restored and repaired. The light wells have significant deterioration, and so those are going to be repaired as well. We have all new lighting under the bridge and associated with the exterior wall of the museum, which is the west wall of the tunnel, if you will. Also, that west wall is being totally restored. It's a sort of a sawtooth metal and glass wall, so that's going to be restored. There's also the existing wall above about 8 feet is missing up there. There's just a closure piece, and so that's going to be renovated, or actually replaced with new metal panels. So that whole facade will basically be new or renovated. And then, as I said, the lighting in there will be improved. That wall will be backlit so that that wall will sort of glow during at night. And then the bridge deck and waterproofing above Dalton will be repaired.
The remaining site piece consists of primarily work that occurs from Dalton Street to the east, so out toward Western Avenue. And that includes repaving of the parking lots, the limestone retaining walls that run on the north and south side of the parking lots are in some disrepair. So it's some removal, fixing, and replacing, but a lot of tuck pointing as well of that limestone. Replacing of the fences around the parking lot. And then kind of up next to the building, there's also some paving that needs to occur for the parking lots to the north and south on the back side of the building, as well as settlement that has occurred around the building, and sidewalks are failing due to that settlement. So we're fixing those areas as well. It'll also have new lighting out on the site and landscaping as well.
Then the next line, contingencies, pretty self-explanatory, but that line, that 54 million includes the construction contingency and a design development contingency. Also includes 2 years of escalation to the start of construction. It includes CM costs and design costs. Also includes what we call general requirements, which is basically temporary facilities, temporary heat, temporary protection and safety, and hoisting during construction. And it also includes, the line doesn't say it, but that's where we put the increased deterioration that's expected from today, basically, until the start of construction.
And then the next line there is pretty self-explanatory as well, but there are certain costs that the museum center will incur direct and not necessarily run through the construction manager. And those are things such as furnishings and fixtures, furniture, any furniture they're going to replace throughout the facility, exhibit protection and or relocation. So as we're performing the work, we need to protect certain exhibits that are here, and then certain exhibits will actually be taken down, stored, and then put back in place following construction. And it also includes an owner contingency as well.
Then finally, the owner costs covered by the operating levy, actually a credit. Those are the funds that are going to be collected from the operating levy while the museum is shut down. So those funds won't be expended, but will actually be a credit to the project. And so that's how we get to the total budget of $188,700.
Could you guys tell me a little bit more about this $55 million number that makes the architectural engineering business look bad, just from that standpoint? But I know you've got a lot of things in there. Is there a reason you've put all those things under one line?
Well, we originally had called it, we were trying to distinguish it between the hard bricks and mortar costs that go into the building versus some of the other things like construction insurance, the design fees, CM fees, and temporary kinds of things that are needed during construction but don't become a permanent part of the building, such as, temporary hoisting, for instance, or the safety and protection of the building. We have about 7.5% contingency in the number as well.
7.5% contingency.
Right.
And what would the escalation number be about?
It's about 5% for the next 2 years.
Okay. And how about the CM fees then?
Pardon me?
CM fees
CM fees are 2.5%.
and design fees?
Design fees, I think, are about 10%. 12. Okay.
Okay.
Wick makes a good point. I mean, given the size of that number, we've done a deep dive on it. We're going to cover it in greater detail later. Go ahead, Mario.
I just had two small questions and then a question about the furnishings exhibits and owner contingencies. ADA and elevators, what number are they in?
The elevators are in the building systems and infrastructure.
Okay.
It's a replacement of all the cabs, all the present elevator cabs. There's 2 of them that are historical, and then the renovation of all the escalators.
Okay. And ADA, anything to deal with on ADA?
ADA is, to the extent that they need to be addressed, will be mostly in the interior architecture line.
Okay. My other question or observation is the 24 million for furnishings, exhibits, and owner contingencies. To me, that's the only thing that's changing the environment for the patron of the museum. And otherwise, when you walk into the building, nothing, anything else is, there aren't going to be many changes if you're spending 24 million on exhibits and furnishings, it would seem. Is that, and I know lighting will have an impact. It's the experience I'm wondering about how that's being addressed.
Sure. And the experience is that is not the experience. So the experience is being addressed in a few ways. You're right, the exhibits, the owner cost for the exhibits, that's for removal, protection, and replacement of those exhibits. But within all the costs, there's the inclusion of some modest expansion of exhibit space, the expansion of functionality for the mechanical systems to allow future exhibits to be able to come to the museum. There's the restoration of the facade and the restoration of the building, which is going to be a renewal of this building for the community. So those are elements that are within all the above costs, but not explicitly broken out.
What about the perception of security and the lighting of the parking lot? What is being done there?
The lights, I believe in the cost estimate, the lights are being replaced in the parking lot.
New site lighting and a new security system for both the building and the site itself.
Just to build on what Scott said, in the original master plan was the concept of a science center. Because right now, museums with science exhibits are attracting more people than those that don't have them. And John, I think it was, mentioned the importance of that in our last meeting. As Scott said, the plan that you're going to share increases modestly the exhibit space, which allows for science exhibits without going all the way to building a new science center. So that should be what we see.
Right, and on top of that, the experience that you'll see coming into this museum after the project that is being described before you is you're pulling into the museum. The facade is going to look completely different. It's going to look renewed. You're going to pull into the parking area, and the lights are going to be restored, and the parking area is going to be repaved, and the fountain's going to be redone. And then you're going to come into the rotunda, and the rotunda is going to be painted, and the acoustics are going to be set up in the rotunda so there can be events in there. And then you're going to go down to the exhibits, and the exhibits are going to be expanded, and there's going to be more flexibility moving forward versus the constraints that are currently put on the museum.
So this is a slide of the initial project schedule. And in this version here, we're looking at the November ballot. And following approval in the November ballot, we'd have about an 18-month design period. That overlaps with construction a bit, but a 30-month construction duration. And this is based upon an unphased construction scenario. So, essentially, construction manager taking over the facility, performing the work and completing it in a 30-month time frame. And that results in completion in the fourth quarter of 2018 at the cost that we just showed you of $188,700,000.
Yeah, there's a second scenario One which allows the museum to stay open for the Children's Museum and certain other large galleries. When you do that, it requires additional protection of the building, protection of the patrons, allowing them to pass through the construction zone, getting into the museums so they can appreciate and enjoy the exhibits. That has an extended duration to it because of that movement of people and pads and sort of limitations of the construction. So because it's not now no longer unimpeded. So that's going to extend the duration of the building construction by about 10 months. And so we have additional extended general conditions. We have extended general requirements. So we have 10 months more of both of those. We have additional temporary HVAC facilities because now we have to keep those spaces warm and cool in the proper seasons. We also have to keep them lit and with power. And as well, during that 10-month period of additional construction, because we're not addressing all of the building at once, there's going to be some additional deterioration that we factored in. We also have 10 more months of escalation. And as I said, we have temporary partitions to keep the construction separate from the public, and also signage to direct them so that they stay safe. So that adds about $10.6 million to the construction budget if we decide to go that direction. And from a schedule standpoint, basically the same start of the project. We have the November 2014 levy. We have the same design duration starting in 2014 and going 18 months. Only difference really is that we're extending the construction schedule another 10 months, which results in another $10 million of work. Yes, sir.
On the initial project cost, you showed a $9 million savings from operating funds not used while the museum is shut down.
Right.
How does that figure in with the 10.6 million here? Does that 9 million still occur or not?
Yes. Yes, it does. Actually, it's probably a bit more because, well, no, I guess some portion of it. Let Scott handle that one.
It would actually increase the amount of operating levy that could be, because the construction periods increase, so you'd actually have more operating levy that you could handle. But on top of all the various phasing from a construction standpoint, there is also additional owner costs that would be incurred that pretty much offset that, along with the deterioration that's occurring in the building.
So that kind of wraps up the looking at the renovation of the existing facility. So the second thing we were tasked with looking at was a new museum option. So what would the cost be if we were to build a new facility and move out of this existing facility? So this is a new museum option for $305 million. And the scope of that would include a new building on this existing site, building it out where the current parking lots are, a 450,000 gross square foot facility with 160,000 square foot of exhibit space. The cost includes tearing down Union Terminal, and also includes new parking lot accommodations, because if we're building out in that parking lot, parking lots would go back where this current facility is. There's some vibration monitoring that would be needed as we're tearing down this facility, and all of the owner costs and fees and contingencies and whatnot that's an all-inclusive number, if you will, from that standpoint.
This scenario is keeping the museum center unified as a collection of museums. There's another scenario that we looked at, but we discounted pretty quickly, which was breaking up the museum center into its respective museum pieces into different buildings. And the reason that was discounted so quickly was number one, you can imagine the increase in overhead costs as you build eating facilities in each one of those separate museums, as you create an administrative staff for each one of those separate museums, as you create a parking lot for each one of those separate museums, and then the difference in experience, which Mario was poking at. If you go to one museum and then you have to drive to another museum, one of the things that makes this museum center unique is that the earned revenue is about 3 times the average of a normal museum in the United States, because in part of the fact that all these museums are collected in one building. So that's the reason we looked at building a like building, and we haven't been able to find one in this area of this size, of this space. 16-foot ceilings for dinosaurs, big garage doors for big crates of delivery for the kinds of displays that we've been able to put on here. Thank you.
Yeah, of course there is that middle ground, right? If you were to be able to find the perfect building, the perfect fit, and move into an existing building, you still have the cost of that property acquisition, which we can't really factor into because we don't know what that would be. You still have the cost to renovate that building. If you do find that perfect 450,000 square foot building, you still have to build all the exhibits of the 160, and you still have the demolition of Union Terminal, and you still have the same owner costs that would be associated with that. So it might not be 188, it might not be 305, but it was something that we couldn't necessarily put our fingers on. Do you have a question, Christian?
Just real quick, if we were going to take out operating costs on a 30-year life cycle, how would that 188 compare to the 305? Is it assumed that all the systems would be fresh in the renovation and it would have the same kind of deferred maintenance needs as, say, a brand new building that was 300, or would you be doing more refresh, more frequent in a renovated building versus a brand new one?
That's an excellent question. I think as we're looking at the 188, we're basically assuming all new systems in the building. So that's a great segue to some of the other things that we'll be talking about, whether or not we have to do all of that work. If you're doing a brand new building with brand new systems, odds are it's going to be about the same kind of cost, the same kind of operational cost, same kind of maintenance, same kind of energy efficiency that you would expect with the systems that we're talking about installing here.
This might not be a question for the design and construction team. It might be one for management. I suspect we have some surveys about patron, the patrons' experience and their feedback on how they like the museum. Obviously, if we have 3 times revenue, that says something. But have we talked with the people that are not patrons, that are part of Hamilton County, the ones that need to vote on this, about, you know, whether they like the experience and the location and all of the things that might influence somebody coming? Because, you know, one thing is to have it 3 times, or maybe it could be 5 times. And so what market research has been done? I suspect that you haven't done that, but
we've looked at those questions. Those are all great questions. Let's first talk about ticket price elasticity. In other words, because that's a great reflection of experience. The Museum Center had some work done pro bono by Procter & Gamble, because Procter & Gamble has a lot of experience with price elasticity. That demonstrated that, well, Mabe, was Mabe here? Yeah, Mabe, why don't you talk about that? You can do it much more expertly than I. Mabe Rodriguez is the Vice President General Manager of Procter & Gamble, on loan to the Museum Center in marketing.
Alrighty, so one of the things that I did as I got into this assignment as executive on loan was to look at when was the last time we increased prices. And it's been about 8 years now, but back then it was so a very long time. So when you think about inflation, well, why haven't we increased prices? Let's go and increase prices. So I went back to P&G and we used some modeling to look at what would happen with attendance once we increase prices. And I won't bore you with all the statistics and all the data that went through, but it's pretty amazing, the modeling that P&G has developed over the years and the systems that we have. And it came out that for every point of price increase, we would see 1 point of traffic reduction. So if you increase, at that point I was thinking, well, let's look at our peer group, you know, the aquarium, the zoo, even Kings Island. Well, we are in the low end in terms of price per ticket for people to come in here. So what if we were to increase by 10% from the $12.50 that we charge today? Well, the thing is that we would get a 10% traffic reduction. So it made no sense to increase prices because it would be a hurt to our business. What we did find out is that if we are to increase the value of the proposition, meaning to add new things that the consumer would see, then that would be a very different scenario. And that's when we talked about the Science Center. So once we have the Science Center, we have the right to charge more because the consumers are going to see more and expect more. So that's the outcome.
And then I guess I would also address Mario's question by talking about some research which the Cincinnati Business Committee did. Kay was part of it, Scott was part of it, where we looked at what percent of voters in Hamilton County would vote for a levy that would restore Music Hall and restore Museum Center. And I don't have the numbers in front of me. Does somebody have them? But basically, Doug might have them, but basically it was about 54%, 55%, as I recall, people would vote in favor of that levy for restoration. Am I remembering the numbers correctly, Doug?
Yeah, that was the flat number before you push-pull things were put on it. There were ways.
It was higher. I'm sorry, Scott's correcting me. It was higher.
My recollection, it was 60-some%, but.
And it's 50-some% on the first call before you added any. All right, they do these things. They ask the question. They ask the question straight, just would you, without any knowledge, and they say, well, if you did this, or if you knew this information, how does that factor into it? And you push-pull on those questions to see if the number goes up or goes down. So there's opportunities for it to go up. Historically, on the tax levies, we passed the last one by 68%. The first one we passed by 63%. And we've always had a higher affirmative vote than the polling indicated. And I think that's because we haven't had organized opposition. If you have organized opposition, that's what really hurts you. And we haven't had that.
Was it cost dependent at all? How much, excuse me, was it cost dependent at all on that polling? How much would it cost to renovate?
We quoted I think we used a $150 million number on that, and the way the question was asked, I'll find that in a minute here. I think the question was asked, I'm looking at Brian because you're involved in that, but it was a $150 million number, and the presumption was that the taxpayer was paying for all of it, because the number was loaded on the per household cost was loaded on the basis of that being entirely a taxpayer expense.
Thank you.
If I may ask, and those were likely voters that those numbers came from?
Yeah, they were likely voters.
Specifically likely voters who?
Yep.
Okay, that's all.
So of course we did get into value engineering. I mean, the effort of this team was about validation and value engineering. So to start with kind of what value engineering was not for this, and it was not a slash and burn of scope, right? There's an easy way to just start taking things out of the project. And what we wanted to do was be very cognizant of what we were raising as ideas, be very careful in working with the design team, with George, with Adam and Art, and the rest of their consultants, so that we were preserving, one, the historic integrity of the building. making sure that things were being put back in the same way that the Secretary of Interior standards would require, because our funding, some of that funding, is contingent upon that. The other thing that we wanted to make sure of is that we were also preserving and finding flexibility for the museum. So this was a good time to be replacing a lot of the equipment. Where you're putting it, the decisions that you're making, you have an opportunity now that you wouldn't necessarily have again if you put something in different or don't do something. So we wanted to take that into account and make sure that we were providing for maximum flexibility that we could afford for the museum. It was very much a collaborative effort. So again, not only between Turner and Messer, but making sure that we were going back to the original design team, that we were understanding the intent, that we were working with Museum Center. So a lot of what surfaced over the last week that we had to do this was coming out of those conversations, the additional tours that we took with Steve Terheiden and with Doug and all the people who were part of this team originally. So while it was an outside team, we took full advantage of the resources that we had. So what we came up with was a series of places, though, that we could cut costs without compromising historic integrity and compromising flexibility of the museum. So I'm going to quickly run through what these plans are, and then I've got some images as well. So in some areas specifically, we were talking about increased flexibility of creating more exhibit space, which of course generates revenue for the museum. We're not talking about doing new exhibits, but some of the mechanical spaces that we talked about relocating elsewhere in the building was in an effort to maximize floor area. So in some of these areas, this space would stay mechanical. This space we can reclaim some because it's high bay space and it's really advantageous for some of the things that a science center might want in the future. In the center of the plan, in this lower level, that's the Children's Museum. Children's Museum is a relatively recent addition to Museum Center. We really don't have to do a whole lot to that space, whether it be finishes, whether it be distribution of electrical, mechanical, those things. So we basically took that 16,000 square feet out of the program. Around these sides, we're protecting the larger exhibits in place. That's the Natural History Museum, that's where the cave is, that's where the public landing is. Some of those large exhibits, adding a premium to relocate those exhibits, protect them, as opposed to protecting them in place, didn't make a lot of sense to us. So we've taken some of that out. And again, like I said, we have modestly increased the exhibit space. The mezzanine level really hasn't changed much. That's, of course, the intermediate level when you're halfway down the escalator towards the Children's Museum. On this level, in the concourse level, first of all, the Omnimax. The Omnimax, while it's original to the Museum Center building, it was actually the recipient of a refresh with all new furniture, all new seats, all new finishes about 8 years ago or 6 years ago. And so to have that in the master plan, which was done prior to the refresh, obviously we can take that out and take that savings. Importantly, in the front area, of course, you saw the windows as you come in, the windows in the arch itself, which were never planned on being removed. But we took the windows out that served the concourse. So we would preserve those historic windows and also the clear stories that you see in the concourse when you're walking through the space. They actually face the rear of the building, but they're really not where our water infiltration issues are. And so we can replace the roof, we can work on the parapets without having to replace those windows. And then also in those concourse areas, there's been a lot of talk about how much of the mechanical systems need to be completely redone and do all new systems versus replace them in kind. So there are rooftop units that serve those spaces. We can put rooftop units back on those roofs and serve those spaces just as effectively without necessarily tying them into a large central plant, putting all new piping. There's also some issues with the logistics, frankly, of getting into some of those ceilings in the concourse areas, depending on which level of the ramp that you're looking at. And Heapy will talk about a little bit of that later. On the first level, this is working our way up through the building. The master plan had originally shown a new office area, an expanded office area in what was the area well, if you were on the north side of the building, and filling that in, putting a new roof on it to expand office area. Well, if we go to more of an open office layout and not a lot of private offices, which is kind of where the industry is going anyway and has better collaborative space and better light and things like that for the people who are working there, we can actually take that out and at the same time reduce the cost of some of the office fit out that had originally been held in the budget. Working our way up the building further again, you see the Omnimax, you see the office areas. Also what we're showing is potentially eliminating the green roofs. You saw the green roof that was put in Project 1. Great investment because it was paid for by MSD, by the Metropolitan Sewer District. Some of those funds are no longer available. If they're not available and we can't find an alternate funding source, we can save significant dollars by removing that from the scope. And again, for those of you who were on the tour and remember walking around the back of the rotunda in these areas, you saw a lot of damaged plaster and water damage. We don't have to go back with museum quality finishes to those spaces. We definitely want to clean it up. We definitely want to fix the leaks, but we don't have to go in there with a high level of plaster and finishes and ceilings because it really is just going to be retained as a connector. The third level, again, these are the office areas, the executive offices for Museum Center, and so they could go also to a reduced scope finish, not necessarily open office for everybody, still having the huddle room, still having some private offices as necessary, but reducing that office scope is a significant savings to the project. Mario, you asked about ADA. Okay. So the ADA requirements that we were looking to meet, Tower A is the only place in the building that is not currently accessible. Tower A is actually managed and funded by the Railroad Club that resides here. We do have the option of taking that out of the scope. That would be the extension of the elevator that serves that space, as well as new finishes in that space, new mechanical equipment, new lighting that was in the master plan. So it's an opportunity for savings. All of these items, or not all of them, but a lot of these items, they aren't necessarily coming out of the scope, but they could be bid as alternate bids. And if we're fortunate enough to find savings, at least we're prepared to do the project without them. And we have a funding strategy that we could do the project without them. But if there are funds available as a result of a good bidding climate, or savings or additional fund sources, some of these things, that would be a primary one that could come back into the scope. So again, another visual version of what you saw or what I talked about in the window replacement. Again, these are historic windows. They're consistent with the windows on the face of the rotunda. They don't necessarily have to be replaced. We talked about the finishes around the rotunda and also eliminating the catwalks. If you remember the high steel tour that we all took, there are several catwalks in the area. The master plan or the discussions that we had with George last week, in order to facilitate easier lighting install and replacement over time, he was proposing we do 3 new rings of catwalks around the rotunda. Probably not something that we absolutely have to do, right? Open office, this is an example of the office area that we walked through on the tour that was done in Project 1. This seems to be suiting the people who work there just fine and is a pretty high quality work environment. New roofs, as we talked about. Protecting the exhibits in place and identify spaces or scope for specific separation from the project or specific funding. So when we come right down to it and what these numbers are, we took each one of the large categories that Messer and Turner just described, and we looked at what the savings would be. So instead of just taking a very simple equation and saying, hey, we're going to find a way to take 15% out of everything, we've done some study so far, but this is still very early in the process as the week that we've had to do this, right? So the building envelope, the 9% savings, is that strategy that we talked about and not replacing all the windows. Changing the approach about how we would clean the limestone, which would actually be a cost savings measure. Reducing the scope of the roof. The mechanical systems and electrical systems, we can easily save 5%, and we'll actually talk about some of that later. So when we work our way down through the scope, we're coming up with about 6% savings without really trying exceptionally hard and compromising the scope of the project. We also have some ideas for potential additional savings, but what they take isn't just value engineering, but maybe some real engineering. And so we'll talk about that later, but we think that we have an additional $7 million in strategy, primarily in the mechanical, the electrical, and also in some ideas about how we could do some early design, early bidding in order to manage that budget a little bit better. Questions? Yes, sir.
I realized I wanted to ask this question earlier before you got to the engineering, but what is, in your estimation, the remaining useful life of this facility, provided no action were taken? And then, if that's 3, 5, 10 years, whatever, and then do we know what it would cost at that point with inflation to then have other options? So I'm just curious about that.
We do have that in some of these equations, and what we're looking at is a combination of the deterioration. We would call it accelerated deterioration, the things that Scott talked about earlier that didn't exist at all in 2006 when the master plan was done, to things that are now a relatively high sense of urgency about them. They're primarily with the envelope. That's the good news. Water infiltration is one of those things that if you don't stop it, it gets worse. And so we're at a good point now where it hasn't compromised the structural frame of the building, the steel of the building. Once that primary structural steel gets compromised, or we get beyond right now, which are primarily loose lintels and corner columns, things that can easily be repaired, then it becomes very cost prohibitive. One of the things that we heard last week when Nancy was here from Silman Associates, the structural engineer, is that if there were significant problems to the building, it would be tearing itself apart, right? We would see if the settlement issues were rampant throughout and they had to do with the foundation system, the movement cracks that you'd see would be a lot worse than what you see, which is primarily now water damage. What we have identified in a cost of not doing much, and we'll get into this in a little more detail, but is about 3.5% per year between inflation and what that deterioration would be costing us. So useful life of the building could be indefinite as we keep the building up. What we're trying to work on here is a 30-year fix to the building so that we're basically starting with a new building again and can take advantage of that useful life.
Thank you.
Doug, I wanted to ask you, the $10 or $11 million that's listed up there to maintain operations during construction, what is the cost of closing the building from a museum center standpoint? So we're going to spend $10 or $11 million more if we keep it open, but there's another cost connected with closing it. So what does that reflect anywhere in those numbers?
I hope you'll appreciate that these exercises, you get to where how many extrapolations can you make to project what, to get to what outcome at what level of accuracy, and so you go on forever. What we know is, yes, we generate a lot of revenue coming here. Some of that's gross, some of that's net, so it's not all, so just because you give up, $5 million of revenue doesn't mean you're going to be $5 million, worse off, because some of those neutralize out. We did keep in the cost of, so one of the things like the owner's expenses here is that we're still paying the utility bills on the building during construction because that was not in the construction cost. So owner expenses during this time period still have $3 million of utility costs, in that number. So yes, there'll be an impact. I think it's in the $1 million to probably $2 million or more in net loss. But that's why we looked at this and we said, because we always wanted to try and keep part of the building open. I mean, our plan originally was try and keep the Children's Museum open. It's the most highly attended museum we have. It has the most faithful kind of patrons. They will be the people who will be the most upset with it being closed. And keep the large exhibit gallery open, because then we could actually schedule traveling shows could come in there, and we could do special exhibits that kind of keep a level of awareness aware to the public. But I said, most importantly, we have to preserve the building for the future, and so tell me what it's going to cost to stay open, and I'll swallow hard, and we'll figure out how to manage that. And we're not going to make $10.5 million, and so I think we got to figure out how we get to the end game, and the end game is we can't incur that expense, because I don't think that's sellable to the public, and so we have to manage that. But you're right, there's an impact.
And one more point to that, those costs are embedded in the owner costs. And when they're escalated over time, that escalation of additional costs in terms of not gaining that revenue is then increased by the escalation.
Can I ask a couple of questions, if you don't mind?
Sure, John.
In the demo and rebuild scenario, what portion of that $300 million was demo of this building?
11 million.
So the demo of this building is $11 million?
Yes.
The other kind of philosophical question / concern I have is we're showing in this budget, in the original budget, $9 million coming from the operating levy. The operating levy expires at the end of this year, and a new levy has not been approved. It seems that really is not a deduct to the cost. The cost is $9 million higher. You're assuming that that's just $9 million of additional money on hand to pay for those costs. So the cost isn't really 177, the cost is 186 million. And we're assuming that 9 million is going to come from the levy that could be extended, the one that expires this year. Am I saying that correctly?
That's correct. Yeah, I mean, I think the prevailing theme of this presentation is there's a lot of assumptions that we're making in this presentation, because right now it's in a conceptual master plan phase. So we're not, these cost estimates aren't based off design documents. They're not based off construction documents. There's certain assumptions we have to make up front and come up with a consensus of what makes sense in terms of overall cost for this project in order to properly engage the public and get feedback from the task force in order to help move this forward, because the last thing that we want to do is start designing in a box and not get feedback from the outside elements and be at a point in time where you're having to redesign things. I think it's important to really engage the public and engage the task force up front with these questions versus later on in the design.
I'm with you 100%, but we seem to be mixing our sources and uses of funds if you leave that $9 million in there. The uses are really $186 million. $9 million is one of your sources. It seems to be kind of mixing apples and oranges there a bit.
Right, and you're correct. If the operating levy budget was not approved to continue, it would be an additional $9 million in cost, which is why we separated it out so explicitly in that number instead of embedding it in the number as an assumed cost.
John's right, of course. I think that the way that came up, John, was as we were discussing it with the leadership of the Museum Center, they felt like if we did get an operating levy, they would be held responsible to reduce these costs by that amount. So it was, in essence, not an assumption that the operating levy was going to happen as much as it was a reflection that the Museum Center leadership felt they would have a responsibility to reduce the costs by the amount of the operating levy. So it was more a reflection of taking responsibility, I think, than it was just trying to reduce the number based on an assumption that the operating levy would happen and be voted on.
Are there any other questions before we move forward?
I just want to say quickly, part of that was when I looked at the numbers and realized the utility bills, which were paid for by the tax levy presently, were going to flip over and get put in the operating budget, but because it wasn't in the construction number. Well, how do you do that? Because I know I'm going to lose revenue. I got to lose revenue and pick up the utility bills when I'm not here against that, and that is what the levy's been for. So it's just a way to manage that somewhat, but call it out clearly.
So the separation of your sources of funds and your uses of funds, and we're putting our source in our use category. You're right.
Yeah, that money can't be used for other things. That money can only be used for building purposes, which is, so you can't, yeah, so you can put there, and I'm not, yeah, it could go anywhere, any place.
Quick environmental question. Were there any assumptions on environmental remediation on the exterior stuff? We're right next to train tracks, and not good things happen over 100 years next to train tracks.
No environmental remediation was considered in this value engineering exercise, but further investigations and due diligence of the site and the overall permitting that needs to be put in place definitely needs to be considered by the design team if they decide to move forward with this project as a reuse of the existing building.
There is, and I think we may have discussed this last week, Christian, there is asbestos in the ceiling, and but it's safe there, and just by repainting it and so forth, we're okay. But we did include remediation and demolition cost, because if we demolish it, obviously that asbestos is free. Not free price-wise, but free in the air.
Okay, so this is I think we hit on this before, but this is the value engineering project schedule where if you have an April operating levy with a November capital levy, and you start the design directly after that, there's going to be an 18-month design period with a slight overlap in construction duration, and that is the assumption that's made for the $177 million project. So the cost of delay, we then took into consideration if, let's say that we decided to push this off a year and delay the project by a year, the additional cost as far as a 3.75% per year building deterioration and cost escalation was associated with that number, and it increases the delay of the project by $6.6 million. And every year that you increase it over that is compounding on top of that. So it would be an additional 6.6, and then you associate your 3.75 on the 183.8.
Can you explain what that cost is, why that cost is that number? Is that inflation plus something else?
Sure, I believe it's a 1.5 inflationary fee, and then the rest, what? 1.25% deterioration fee, and the rest is for inflation. So the 1.25% deterioration is associated with the building structure, the structural deterioration that's going on. It's just separated out in that element of the project because, as we've discussed, the mechanical systems are going to be replaced. So either that deterioration is not accounted for, but just the deterioration of the building is going to add to that along with the inflationary. So then we looked at another scenario of, let's say we didn't, originally we were looking at waiting for the November capital levy to start the design period and have an 18-month design period. Let's say that we move that up and actually start after the April operating levy for the design. That allows us to move up the design to allow construction to start sooner, which actually realizes a cost saving of $4.4 million by allowing the design to start 10 months earlier than it was previously planned for.
So if we were confident that a capital levy could happen, or we knew how to fund the construction, and if we spent the $2 million roughly for design starting immediately, that would result in about $4.5 million of savings at the back end, because we would have done design without waiting for the money from the capital levy to pay for it. That could be either philanthropy or corporate donations or something.
So I want to point out one thing. It hasn't been mentioned yet, but if let's say we do this expedited design and start today and move forward with this project, we're still not looking at a solution, a full solution, the construction ending until the beginning of 2018. So it's a long design and approval and construction process. The construction time period, just if you're vacating the building and doing that, it's 3 years. Having people in here and doing a partial phasing is an additional 10 months. So it's a long process that we need to consider. So that was a lot of numbers that we threw up in front of you, so I'm just going to summarize them now. If we invest in the existing building, we're looking at a $177 million project. Early design, we have an additional savings, and we're also going to be talking about some next step savings that we feel like we can bring that number down to around $170 million. Then there's the option of relocating the museum, which is $305 million. And then let's say we want to delay this process for another year. We're looking at an increase in cost to $183 million. So on top of these value engineering elements that Steve just described and to reduce this cost, there's also some other designs that were considered as kind of next steps. These are next steps of additional cost savings that we could have, along with additional next steps that need to be done in order to confirm that the assumptions that we made are correct. So we're going to look at the geotechnical review, building envelope recommendations, and additional infrastructure savings. So we hit on the geotechnical aspects of this project a little earlier, but this is a typical cross-section of what's occurring beneath your building. There's about 30 feet of uncontrolled fill that was placed on this site prior to the construction of the building. On top of that fill, there's an alluvium layer of sand, silt, and clay. This is a compressible layer that over time, with the additional load on top of it, has been settling, which is why you're seeing the settlement in your slab-on grades, both interior and exterior. You can see that this is an example of the wall cracking that is occurring out at the site. I think, as Nancy mentioned, the structural building is in good condition, and if maintained over time. And one point I didn't mention before that I really wanted to point out is one thing that she said is, and it rings true, where if you build a new building, you have a building that hasn't been speaking with you structurally for a period of time. If you go 30 years in advance, there's going to be certain aspects of that building that were constructed properly. There's other aspects of that building that were not necessarily constructed in the best methods, possibly, that you're going to have to repair. We have a building here that's 80 years old that's been speaking to us structurally for the past 80 years. There's things that we see on this building that we know were done well, and there's things that we know were not done well that we can address at this time. So if you have a building that you're addressing the items that aren't done well, and you have other items that you know are done well, you actually increase your life expectancy of your building more than you would if you're building a new building that you don't know necessarily how it's going to be speaking to you structurally over time. So some of the additional geotechnical investigations that I think are necessary to confirm that this building is structurally sound is we need to do an investigation of the wood piles on the building. The wood piles are not typical construction for steel and concrete buildings in this area, according to local engineers that we've spoken to. So we want to take a look at them and make sure that what the building is telling us is true in terms of the condition of the wood piles. So what we want to do is we want to do a thorough walkthrough of the building and come up with a test pit and boring program that we could take a look at what type of soils are on this site and determine how deep the piles are and determine what type of soils that they're bearing on, whether they're friction piles, meaning they're actually just bearing on the friction, withstanding on the friction caused by the soil, or if they're bearing piles which are bearing on bedrock, directly on bedrock and being held up by the bedrock below. So I think it's important not only to do that test pit boring program to determine the condition and how the piles are reacting, but also to take a look at the retaining walls, because you can see from this picture, a lot of the retaining walls on site have some damage. We want to put crack gauge monitors on these retaining walls along with tilt monitoring and monitor them over time to determine whether they're currently moving or if this was a movement over 80 years and it's kind of settled into place. But I think that's important to take a look at to determine whether these are actively moving and how to address them. Now I'm going to turn it over to our structural engineer.
All right, from the structural standpoint, the main thing that we want to kind of delve into a little bit more as the next step is the building envelope itself, and specifically 4 areas. The parapet wall cap concepts, we want to dig into that a little bit more from a durability standpoint as well as a historical standpoint. And when I talk about the parapet wall cap, it's kind of that area at the top of the wall. When you were on the tour, you could see that that was all individual pieces of terracotta. And what we want to try to do
These
is
are thoughts that you have for additional savings?
cost savings. And
beyond the amount that we've shown so
right,
far?
They're kind of in that pot at the bottom of additional savings. So with the cap, we want to try to maybe look at another way to increase its efficiency for shedding water, and that may open up opportunities for different alternatives for roof systems, which is a big driver of cost savings if we can go to a different roof system. We know from Project One that the structural steel on the south side of the building turned out to be in very good condition. We would recommend on the north side of the building, early on in the design process, or even as an upfront study before that started, maybe doing some small test excavations into the masonry wall to verify the condition of the steel. We know from our walkthrough on the north side that we think the deterioration is more advanced than the south side, so we would want to confirm before we got surprised during construction that things are a little worse. At the rotunda, the back of the rotunda, you can see that there's masonry distress and it kind of pulls a pattern. Further engineering needs to be done there in terms of a study. What we need to verify is the masonry distress mainly due to water infiltration, or is it tied to the main trusses for the dome? And if so, what condition is that steel in? So that again is another upfront piece that we want to do. And the limestone cleaning of the facade of the main face of the dome. You can see here that there's a number of areas that have quite a bit of staining and other areas that don't. There's a number of different ways that that could be addressed, some of which comes with some significant cost savings. We would want to try to do a study up
I
front.
thought we could get Procter & Gamble to donate Tide.
Tide, yes, yeah. And we're all for that. So, but we think there's a couple ways to maybe do a quick study of that up front that may result in an overall savings to the job. And you know, those are kind of in that pot of savings ideas that we have for further scope reduction, but in a week and a half there wasn't time to really dig into doing some testing on these kind of things at this point. And I think Brian's going to hit mechanical next.
I guess first off, I'd like to thank the museum administration and facilities, and then Keith this week. We've all spent a lot of time together going over some of the thoughts. The master plan's calling for complete replacement of the mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems. And there's a lot of good reasons for this, and I kind of want to re-hit it because it was a big deal. But the age and condition of the equipment, almost all of the equipment here has exceeded its expected useful life, and so it's ready to go. Energy efficiency is number one in everybody's workplace today, is how can we save money in operations, and energy efficiency is a big piece of that. And so the replacement of the equipment that we're talking about, we're going to get more efficient equipment as we go forward, but we're also going to get a building automation system that'll take care of your heating and air conditioning control system, optimize when it runs, when it's off, and do a better job of temperature and humidity control throughout different spaces in the building. They're also going to look at putting a lighting control system in the building so we can better manage when lights are on and off, so we don't have spaces that are lit where nobody's in them. Right now that's manual function in a lot of spaces, so we want to take advantage of the technology that's with us. Use of the facility, I know it's been hit on, but I got to reiterate, there's a lot of areas or zones in the heating air conditioning world where a single system serves dissimilar spaces. So we're hitting offices with the same air that we're hitting the exhibit galleries, and we're humidifying and trying to keep tight temperature control for exhibit spaces to protect the exhibits. And we're wasting that energy and cost in those office spaces. So part of this project is let's get those zones separated and take advantage of the systems that we can use that are modern. And the last item here is to increase capacity for additional gallery space. So, we're trying to free up space that's down in the lower level. There's existing dirt floor areas that could be easily turned into exhibit space, but we don't have capacity in the central systems now. So we're looking at, like on the chilled water plant, which is your cooling source for your cooling systems, increasing that capacity to be able to handle those spaces. And lastly, looking at increasing the capacity on our generator system. So we have redundant power to maintain the exhibit spaces so that we don't lose protection on our exhibits as well as our stacks. One of the items that was hit on last week as a potential cost to the project and is budgeted to protect this facility is to add a smoke evacuation system into the rotunda. That system is probably not necessary, but it needs to be validated. But here's the kind of the backstory. In 1990, when the project was thought out, they looked at it and said, how do we sprinkle this? Well, the rotunda, at 106 feet tall to the peak, sprinklers are ineffective. Sprinklers don't work beyond 55 feet, and nobody wants sprinklers in that beautiful aesthetic space. So they looked at it and said, all right, what can we do? So they put in a smoke control system, and they negotiated with the building inspectors and said, if we do this, will you consider this building fully sprinkled? And they said, yeah, that makes sense. That system is probably still adequate today. It just needs to go back to the building inspectors as we move forward with the renovation project and make sure that they still feel that way. But that has a lot of cost impacts and savings to the project by just maintaining the systems that are in place. Last week also there was a big discussion about freeing up lower level mechanical spaces and trying to get mechanical equipment off the lower level because that would be prime gallery space. It's high bay areas. It's easy to get displays in and out. Working with the museum administration, we kind of determined that we probably don't have to move all of the mechanical equipment through this project. We could probably try to save areas. So we looked at the south mechanical room and the north mechanical rooms and said, what could we save? What would be most advantageous to the facility if we save something? And we looked and determined that the south mechanical room could stay. So the north mechanical room, there's one large mechanical unit in there. We tried to find ways to relocate that where we could save most of the infrastructure that we talked about saving for the Children's Museum, and we've kind of come up with a tentative plan using the mezzanine as a way to facilitate that happening. One of the other big items here was the heating system. So what is in the master plan is to replace the existing steam and hot water system that's in the building, one for one, essentially. And the reason why this is important is steam is very inefficient to produce. And if we're using it purely for heating, which is 90% of what we're doing with the steam out of this system, we're wasting money. So what we're proposing is to convert this existing steam and hot water heating system to a purely hot water heating system. The humidification that was coming off here was limited to like 2 zones in the building. The rest of the humidification was provided by electric humidifiers that were spread out. We propose to continue to do that. It makes sense for the museum, for the exhibits, tighter control of local spaces, and it saves us first cost in infrastructure, and also operational costs. That steam boiler is probably 80% efficient. The hot water boilers have been proposed are closer to 90% efficient. One of the other big items in this project is to replace all the air handling units. And to try to simplify this is an air handling unit, for the most part, is a big box where components are selected and put in it to cool and heat the building. The box is just a box, and you can, if the box is in good condition, you can reuse that box. And so what's inside there is usually a heating coil, a cooling coil, and some fans. What we'd like to do requires more investigation to validate how much savings we could yield out of this, but reuse the boxes we have. The boxes that were put in 1990 were really high quality compared to a lot of the equipment you would buy today. So we try to reuse this as a first pass. So this requires further study, but this is a viable option for saving funds as we move forward. I know we've kind of hit on this already, but we'll talk briefly about it again. But the ramps, in the master plan, it was discussed moving the rooftop units off the ramps, putting an air handler either on the ramps or up into the towers that flank either side of the rotunda. We kind of looked at this in more detail, pulled out drawings and looked at sections and said, you know, if we put the air handlers in the towers and we had to get air and ductwork down into the ramps, how would we do that? You start to look at it and there's beams that cross the paths everywhere you try to go to get ductwork into there. And that's where there's a little bit of space. And then you get out to where the trolley ramp was, and there's no space above the ceiling. So the current recommendation is let's replace in kind. And I know Steve hit on that earlier. And the last item that we want to hit is electrical. The electrical scope called for replacement of all the electrical equipment. Well, the electrical gear was put in 1990, and parts of it goes bad. I guess to relate it to what most people are used to, circuit breakers, well, there's breakers in that gear, and some of those can wear, and you do want to replace those over time or make sure they're rebuilt. But the gear itself is large copper bussing, and it's in good shape. We would recommend reusing that gear, replace the breakers, and there is significant cost savings to the project available there. So that's the items that I wanted to present. Anybody have any questions before I? Yes, sir.
I brought up that question about replacing in kind on the HVAC versus a new system with George last week when we were here. And then I thought I heard today that we were replacing all the HVAC system, but then I thought I heard you say it's replacing the equipment in kind. So could you clarify for me what's in the $177 or $188 million number?
So the way that large number is, it's replacing the whole system. What I've just gone through is some exceptions to that that have not been priced, but we've tried to quantify that in the $7 million additional savings reduction. So we're trying to carry it, but it's not in the master plan or in that initial budget that was shown here today. Great. Anybody else? Thank you.
So based off all this information we just went over and our analysis over the past couple of weeks, we came up with a recommendation of our valuation team to the task force to consider. And the recommendation that we came up with is to invest in the existing building. We think that the master plan was well put together by the design team. It's very detailed and it's well thought out. I think that should be utilized as a basis of work. Implement some of the scope, implement the scope reduction recommendations that we just went through. That's recommended. Renewal of the Museum Center operating levy on the May 2014 ballot. This is key because we just went through the escalation costs that are included by pushing this down the road. So we think it's really important to address this immediately to be able to get the best cost for the community for this project. And capital improvement levy for the music and Union Hall Terminal on November 2014 ballots, and figure out a way to accelerate the design schedule so that after the May operating levy is put in place, that they can start in with their design and possibly even before that to allow the construction to start and end sooner. So are there any questions or questions for the team?
Scott, this is less about the construction cost and more about a view towards the public sentiment to having a ballot request in April and another one in November. The distinction between the two will have enough clarity.
Well, that was one of the reasons that we felt it was important to separate the two, because if they were both on the same ballot in the fall, we felt like there would be that confusion. I mean, maybe Bob could speak more to this, but.
We'll spend more time on funding after we go through Music Hall. I'd be interested in your ideas. But this was just the evaluation team's point of view. We need to decide as a task force what to propose.
Scott, I like the idea of the early design phase. Was any thought given to speeding up construction? It seems like there's still a pretty big lag between when design starts and construction starts. Knowing what we know about the phase one work and how much work has to be done on the envelope, is that a feasible thing to consider? Of, you know, I'm concerned about the amount of escalation that's already in the project. Is it at the same time, you know, rust never sleeps, so things are continuing to deteriorate. Knowing that design would likely take longer for the programmatic work inside the building, but the skin is something that we have a pretty good handle on what needs to be done. Would that help us?
I think the design team thinks that there's fixes that need to be immediately done to this building, and they've also stated last week that they think the delivery method for this building is a construction manager at risk, meaning the construction management team comes on early in the project. And whenever that happens, there's always the collaboration between the construction management team and the design team to come up with ways to put together early design packages in order to expedite the construction process. So I completely agree that that's a great idea.
Scott, not seeing any other questions. If it's okay, let's keep.
I had one question I wanted to revisit.
Yeah, please.
So this was communicated before, but I thought this was a great question that was asked by John last week, and I'm sorry if I paraphrased you in this question instead of stating exactly, but you asked, how will this project benefit the community? And I mean, we hit on it in a lot of ways today, but I mean, through this process, through this process, I think our evaluation team realized how important this building is to the community. And the reason we realized this is, I mean, we saw such collaboration between so many architects that usually work as competitors nationally and locally, engineering firms that usually work as competitors, construction management firms. I've never in my career seen such collaboration on one thing, and whenever it's mentioned to them, the answer is we need to get this project going, and we need to figure out a solution to this problem. And there's also a passion that people have towards this building. Whenever we discuss it, whenever I start discussing the project with people like Keith, he showed me a picture of his wife in front of this building 15 years ago. Steve showed me a picture of his wife and him on their wedding night here having a reception. And I think there's this passion that goes along with this building to people. And I think them walking up to this building and realizing it's fully restored and renewed will bring the community together. And I think that's something that will benefit the community. When they drive up to this building, instead of seeing a building that's deteriorating over time, they see a building that's renewed. And then I also think that the modest increase of exhibit space and the flexibility that's involved with the museum in the future really is going to make this museum something that could expand into the future and go into the future, and you're going to be able to see the top name exhibits come to your city, and you're going to be able to show your children these exhibits and have your children come here and enjoy this experience being here. So that's my thoughts on how this benefits the community.
Thank you, Scott. I'd like to thank Scott, and I'd like to thank the evaluation team, Steve, and everyone else from Langen and GBBN for the work that they've done and presented today. They're going to continue to be with us. What we wanted to do, and I'm cognizant you haven't had a break for a long time, but what we'd like to do is go right into Music Hall if we can. Steve Leeper is with us. Steve, if you don't mind coming up front. And while you do that, I'm going to try to embarrass Steve. It's always been my desire to be able to introduce him at some point. He's a hero of mine. If you think about the redevelopment of Cincinnati, I don't know that there are too many people that deserve as much credit as Steve Leeper. Thankfully, we stole him away from Pittsburgh in 2004. I think so far we've done, what, about $500 million of redevelopment in Cincinnati under Steve's leadership. I know in Procter & Gamble, I think our initial investment in 3CDC was 25 million. And today I think the value on that is about 70 million because we've continued to reinvest the dividends that Steve has come up with. So when it comes down to the history of Cincinnati and the redevelopment of Cincinnati, I think Steve is going to have a chapter all to his own. Steve is responsible for the music hall project because it falls within 3CDC's jurisdiction. And he and I and our respective engineers and development specialists like Adam and Scott are working together to try to keep these two projects consistent against the same standards, against the same timetables moving forward. Steve, did I appropriately embarrass you? Thank you.
Is this on? Yep, now it is. Thank you very much. I think what we have to say here is probably slightly different than what our colleagues who preceded us had to say. It's always a little intimidating to follow a bunch of architects and engineers. So fortunately, I brought my colleague Jeff Martin with me, who is our chief construction manager and architect by trade, and can provide me with the technical support. What I'd like to do is give you a brief summary of where we are on this project. We took this on maybe 6 months ago, did some initial work, had a little bit of a stop period, but now we're back on it with the idea that we can run on a parallel track with the folks from the Museum Center as we do an assessment of this building. What we really are trying to do right now is identify the real differences between the previous scope of work that was done, and that scope of work was fairly developed. It had darn near gone to construction drawings. It's gone through design development, so it was a pretty mature concept before it took a radical step backward, and it went from a $165 million scope back down to a $94 million scope. And so one of our first tasks was trying to sort through with our friends at GBBN and Messer, what exactly now do we have in the project, and if there are things that actually should be added back, because that's a pretty dramatic change when you go from 165 million to 95 million. And it might be appropriate, but a lot of the work that we're doing now is to assess those changes. The major items that got removed from that was originally there was this suggestion that there needed to be more building. The building's already 250,000 square feet, but the idea was that we needed additional building, and that additional work was essentially to the parking lot to the south. So the idea was to buy that property that's not owned by the music hall folks, and to build an additional building there that would provide some additional uses. That was removed. The ballroom upgrades and configuration was removed. The renovation of CSO offices was removed. The big thing, which was a very costly thing, was the leveling, essentially, of the building. Try to picture in your head when you're in the lobby, the main lobby, and then if you either go to the north or south in each one of those wings, you proceed down to a different level. The idea was to lift the building up and have one consistent level, one gigantic lobby, and that, in fact, was removed. So the leveling, and there was a suggestion that there should be 2 restaurant spaces in that building, and that was eliminated. We'll talk a little bit about what we think about some of these eliminations and some of the things that we would ask to pursue. There was the opening of the carriageways, and I think this is a pointer, but yeah, right there, in these areas, which, you know, ideally is a pretty dramatic thing and actually could could be exciting. Again, it's a cost-benefit analysis that needs to be done. And then there was the new elevators in the north and south halls that were relocated to the tower. So they went from here and over here to these two locations. So as we go through these floors, and I'm not going to get into detail, you can see where the gray areas here represent things that are essentially not happening any longer. And there's probably no real need to go into this detail, but as you go up the floors, you can see that there are big chunks of things that get taken out of there, again, repeating some of these major items here. If you look today at strictly the hard construction budget, this doesn't include the general requirements and other things that on the construction side that would bring us to about $71 million. This is where the breakdown of some of the cost, and you can see that there's a lot of money in the MEP and infrastructure. So the mechanical, electrical, and plumbing, there's nearly $12.5 million there. The main hall and stage house has a $21 million number. And then there's a series of issues pertaining to the circulation and the amenities in the main, or the perimeter of the main hall. And then, of course, the back of the house and CSO. And you can see that a lot of this stuff starts to dwindle down in terms of total value. And then what you see here now is about $4 million is being proposed to be spent on the exterior of the building, doing some tuck pointing, opening up some of those bricked-in windows, and some roof work as well. And then if you add in some of the cost, additional construction cost up here, that gets us to the $71 million number, and then the related soft cost, it gets us to a almost $95 million number. These are some of the items that we felt right away needed to be addressed. First of all, we went back to all the resident companies and asked them, of the things that were taken out, what are some of the things that you think are important that should be reconsidered? Secondly, we again want to address this issue about circulation. It's circulation and access to the building, and then once you get in the building, how do you move around the building? And particularly to get into the hall, to get up, and to get into the various amenities. And then there's a need, what is the real level of upgrades and enhancements to Music Hall? I think what we do not want to have happen is to spend all this money and then walk into the building and look around and say, did we really do anything here? And so I think there's a consensus, and based on what I saw from the previous presentation, I don't think that this building is quite in the same state as this building in terms of deterioration, although when you go into Music Hall, the thing that I think the first thought that comes to your mind is just how tired it is. It does need a facelift. So again, there is a proposed upgrade, mechanical, electrical, and plumbing. What we need to understand is what is being proposed to be retained, what is supposed to be new. This does include reusing the chiller plant, but the electrical systems and capacity will be increased with new substations. So we need to really dig into this with the folks from GBBN and the folks from Messer. The lighting, which is always important, both to is being upgraded in all the renovated areas, including the building facade, which we think is important. The exterior of the building and opening those windows in the building facade along Elm Street is important. We might not do all of that around the back of the building. And again, I think it's just a cost-benefit thing, and to the extent that if we were to open up the windows and bring light in and to do the greater enhancements, we would recommend that you do it primarily on Elm Street. And then, again, the masonry and tuck pointing will go on all four sides, and then the roof work. Now, the city has been doing a good job of sort of maintaining the roof and actually putting some additional new roof on. I believe, Joel, we recently have done some. So we're sorting through what's been replaced and what needs to be redone. So here's the resident company's proposed enhancements. They felt that it was very important that we improve the performer support spaces, so the dressing rooms and other areas. And I have to tell you, we walked that building, I agree with them. And it's something you can do with, I think, in a responsible budget. So There was a riser system, which we all think is important, and we'll talk about this added second rehearsal room, which was particularly important, I believe, for the CSO. If anybody's been to the library that they have, the music library and the music hall, it really looks like something out of the 1800s, and it too needs some change and it needs modernity put forth. There's a whole medium priority would be the redesign of the South Wing administrative offices, so the entrances that you come into the building, and the ticketing and will call and other things. The media boards in the lobby, just some high-tech additions to that to bring some information to the lobby area, and then the catering kitchen, which is probably as much something we're pushing as it is the residence groups. The lower priority is to improve the existing rehearsal space and to coordinate a sprung floor expenditure. We really agree with most of these enhancements. We do think we should establish about a $90 square foot restoration budget for the performers support spaces, and the CSO offices. Again, those need to be redone. They need to be opened up, and I think it will provide for a much better working environment. And again, I think we can do that in a responsible budget. I think the second rehearsal space is a bit of a challenge because it's just, that was part of the reason why that building was being proposed in that parking lot next door, was to create this additional space. So I would say that one of the most difficult things we're going to have to address is whether or not the second rehearsal space can be done within the footprint of the building and within a reasonable budget. So that's something that we're working on now. And then some additional things that we have been working on with GBBN and Messer. And we looked at this, first of all, again, access into the building. It's very important that we get this right because of the folks that, particularly the demographic that goes into this building, and we do need to have proper access and proper elevator access. And it was proposed to move them into elevators into these two tower areas. We were against it for a variety of reasons, but the main one is it didn't really give people sort of a dignified access into the building. They were essentially waiting outside to get into an elevator. That is never any good. I mean, just to give you an example, we used to have exterior elevators on Fountain Square that were just, it was not a good situation. And the other example would be one that you see down there at Tower Place in the middle of the sidewalk there. There's this elevator. It's just not the way to go. So the idea would be that do we have a set of elevators here and a set of elevators here? And we went back and forth on this. And what we thought was we really can get away with one set of elevators up into the building. We don't need to have two sets of elevators, and that we create a main entrance for handicap access or for others that just may need to use an elevator. And we would create a major entrance down here in the south end of the building. And Jeff, if I'm forgetting anything, please jump in. When I start going into uncharted waters, he knows to come help. The other issue was the escalator. And we made the mistake of asking the deadly question, do we really need escalators in this building? And it was kind of as if we were asking, do we really need to continue to keep the lady, the genius of water on Fountain Square when we redo Fountain Square? It was, so we went to an event. In fact, I went to several events to watch the traffic before and after an event, and it is a major source of movement in that building. People are used to it, and to be honest with you personally, I don't know how you could conceivably move people in that building simply by steps and by elevators. I just don't see it. So, I'm willing, and we have a sort of differing views even amongst our own colleagues here, but I think our sense is that we would replace and upgrade those. Those elevators are tired, or escalators are tired. And so the question would be, what is the replacement and what are the options, whether we need one, whether we need two, whether we need to put them in reversible directions and all those sorts of things. But I think it the conclusion is that we definitely need the escalators replaced. Excuse me. The other issue is the freight elevator, which is presently in the front of the building. And what we're proposing is you move it to the back of the building. It'll serve the food service, it'll serve the back of the house for the stage much better. And it'll serve the ballroom, it'll serve Corbett Tower. So we're proposing to move it to the back of the building. And then repurpose that space in the southeast corner for the box office, on the first floor level, and a lounge on the second level, and a meeting room on the third level. So when we eliminate that, we're opening up a bunch of opportunities for programming. And then really make that South Hall entry the main entrance for particularly folks who are either going in to get tickets for will call, maybe even for, obviously for handicap access. And then we would have a new stairs created between the south lobby and the main lobby, so up the steps, and that the relocated freight elevator on the first floor would allow for the box office, and then the other things that we talked about, the lounge and the meeting room on the third floor. And then the ballroom. We strongly believe, meaning 3CDC strongly believes, that we need to enhance that ballroom. It is really something that's for the public's use. It can be a revenue generator. It needs a facelift as well, but including to the ballroom, we're asking to actually slightly shrink it, and then so we can provide some amenities in the front end, including a bar, and get the bar out of the back of the ballroom here, and then open up and provide for a really strong kitchen, and allow that kitchen to be a catering kitchen that can be full service, that could provide service to not only the ballroom, but for Corbett Tower or some other location. That would mean that we need to explore the location, the impacts of the organ, and there's all kinds of things associated with that, and we need to work through those. So we would essentially be losing one bay here in the ballroom. And then we also had this idea that maybe, from that area there, that we could create some exterior space. I guess it's right here, Jeff, is that correct? In the carriageway that you could actually get outside. So you could be in the ballroom and create an exterior exposure outside and an outdoor patio area that I think could be an amenity to the ballroom. Again, it's a cost factor and other things. It was not that important of an element to the resident companies. I can imagine, particularly for the CSO, which because of the time of year that they do those things. So again, these are nice things to have. Whether or not we need them remains to be seen. And then, of course, the carriageways, and what we want to do is utilize the carriageway on the first floor on the north for a VIP area, restroom and concession. So that would be in this area here. So most of the VIP area was the Critics Club, which was sort of, you walk down those steps into that little room down there. What we're suggesting is put it on that floor, bring some modernity to it, create the bathrooms, and so we would use that carriageway to provide that service both for a private VIP area, restrooms, and concessions. This area is big enough that we could play around with whether or not we even have a concession there, whether we make that all VIP, whatever the case may be. But that's what we think is the main use of that carriageway in there. And then on the second level, we could create terraces on the north and south carriageway roofs that could be outdoor space. Again, not a high priority for the residence company, and again, it could be a casualty to budget items as we move on. North Hall. When we eliminate the Critics Club, it now provides us some space. So the question is, do we put the library down there? There's a number of opportunities there, but we should definitely repurpose that space, and there's really no need to touch the opera offices because they've just been redone. So we think we would also, the last thing is, Jeff, we were going to also create restrooms down there. Bring new more. Yeah, we would renovate the restrooms down there. Now, mind you, and we'll get to this a little bit later, by doing that, it will not be handicap accessible, but we will have plenty of handicap accessible restrooms on the first level. So we think it probably makes sense to give some options for some restrooms down in that area. And then Corbett Tower, the beauty is that the south elevator will provide access to the renovated Corbett Tower and the new third floor meeting room. The new third floor meeting room is sort of this, back in here is sort of this dead space now, but it's actually has a beautiful view of Washington Park and of over the Rhine, and it's possible that we could really take that space over and for a relatively small amount of money renovate it, and it could be a special meeting room. And again, it's something we should look at and decide whether or not it's appropriate. And then provide catering, kitchen, pantry services to Corbett Tower, again, from the kitchen. And then the concessions, we're going to create smaller concessions in the corner areas flanking the main hall on the first and second floor. So what we're suggesting is right outside of the main hall, a la the Airnoff. If you go to the Airnoff, that's essentially where they are there. We are considering the possibility of creating those main concessions right outside the main hall. The challenge is, of course, is circulation and whether or not that queuing creates a problem. So we need to think through all those things. But ideally, I think that's a real possibility for us. And then the point of the restrooms. What we've done is the floor plan originally where the restrooms are, and they thought that some of this isn't working very well, but back in this area over here, you got it, Jeff? Is where the original restrooms are. What we're suggesting is that along those carriageways, we would create these new restrooms, handicap accessible, and then some additional restrooms down below in the former Critters Club area. And what we've done is, in each of these areas, there are presently the idea that we went back and forth on this as to whether or not we maintain these as restrooms. These are up on this second floor, and we thought it would be nice to open those up and have them be balcony, but after further review, we decided to maintain these as restrooms, correct? And then these obviously are all handicapped. These are not handicap accessible. You actually have to walk up some steps to get to them, but we thought it was probably appropriate to go ahead and keep them. And then these are the restrooms up on the upper floors. Right now, our goal is to try to keep this budget right around, this has sort of been Otto's message to us, keep this thing as close to $100 or less, maybe $99,999,000, but he would like to try to keep this number at this $100 million level. I think it's a real possibility that we're going to be able to do that. We have a lot of work to do. We are going to be working with GBBN next week, I believe. We're doing another tour of the building to try to finalize what the program is going to be. And once we have a proposed program that we can get the Music Hall Revitalization Board to review and bless, we will then go on what's called a parallel pricing exercise using Messer and then a third party and go through that pricing exercise. Again, start to pick off things that might make sense to eliminate or add, whatever the case may be, to try to get us to a both hard and soft cost budget that we can bring before this group and say, this is where we are now, here's our program, here's our price. We are also on a simultaneous track, going to make sure that we incorporate some expertise on historic renovations and to make sure that whatever we're doing to this building does not preclude us from getting historic tax credits, because we think it's a real possibility here. And we're going to be able to use Memorial Hall as a guinea pig. We just got tax credits from state tax credits from Memorial Hall, and we're going to use that as both in terms of how do we legally and financially structure these leases to accommodate it. But if you can imagine, if we would be successful at getting both state and federal historic tax credits on this, we're hoping that it can be a $10 to $15 million benefit to this funding program. And I don't believe that that's something that we can let slide. So we're constantly thinking about that as well. So what are the next steps? Again, reach consensus on the proposed program for pricing purposes, determine, and this is really critical, determine what portions of the new program have already been designed, that we've already paid for, and then what portions of the scope require further design and development and pricing. So, you know, we're going to recommend a program. Some of it has, GBBN's done a lot of work, and it's done and ready to go, and then there's probably some elements that either need to be changed or totally need to be redesigned. Again, the historic tax credit consultant, which we want to jump on early, obtained some quotes for further design work. So in other words, once we've reached that point and we want to sort of proceed on, if we all get the nod that this is going in the right direction, and I heard you discussing this earlier, is there work that we need to continue on doing with the design team? We need to establish a budget, and of course, working with our CM and a third-party cost estimator is the next bit of work that we need to be doing. So that's where we are, and I'm here. Both Jeff and I are available for questions if you have any.
I believe early on when you were doing a redesign that you were going to reduce the number of seats in the hall. Has that been determined?
Yeah, we are maintaining the same number of seats.
3,400?
Is it 3,400? I think it is 3,400. Yeah, I do not think there is a major change in the seating.
It's 3,400.
Maybe a more appropriate answer, because the specific number isn't coming to mind, is the original scope and then the scope reduction exercise that the music hall team and Messer and GBBN went through before our involvement. That number has not changed. So we are maintaining the scope that was agreed on.
From the $165 million.
The hall is
Okay.
getting new seating. I believe it is reduced, but I don't know specifically what that number is.
We have not reduced it from the original $165 million proposal.
Yeah, and if I excuse me, if I recall, it was between 800 and 1,000 seats would be removed, which would take it into the low 2000s for the
And that was
total
the
number of
original
seating.
concept for the, primarily at the request of the CSO, I believe. So we have not changed that. We're not proposing to change it anyway. Other questions?
If there are no more questions, Steve and Jeff, I'd like to thank you very much for coming, and we'll continue to look forward to working together, and thanks for everything that you've done on this project. And the task force and those members here, I think we should take a break. Let's take about a 10-minute break, and there's refreshments in the room next door. And please be back in your seats in 10, 15 minutes. Thank you. Can we please regroup? This is the summary slide from the Cincinnati Business Committee survey on the funding of Music Hall and Union Terminal. And as you can see, the numbers are pretty identical for Music Hall and Union Terminal at 61, 62%, 33, 34% definite. This was done in November of 2012, so it is a bit dated. And then you can see the combined was 56%, 29% definite. And then there was a question asked about sales tax. So that's the summary slide. What I thought I'd do now very quickly, so we can get into some discussion, is to cover potential sources of funds. Steve talked about Music Hall being about $100 million, and if we do, as John suggested, taking out the $9 million over the 3-year life of the project from the operating levy for Union Terminal, we'd be up to about $179 million or so. assuming some of the value engineering. So we're talking about $279 million or $275 million, assuming we can work it down. These are the sources of various sources of funding. There's a list in front of you. We've put all of these on a list. There's new market tax credits, historic tax credits. There's all kinds of private sector funding available. There's federal money available, state money available, local money available. Yesterday we met as an evaluation team with a group of folks who do energy credits, energy subsidies, and we identified numerous federal, state, and local energy subsidies that we could get to help fund it. But obviously a lot more work is needed to be done here. I'm not an expert on this. I know many of you are much more expert than I am. But we'll need to do this work to figure out how to get the total down that would need to be done through a tax levy. There are other sources of funds. These are all very relatively minor, but other sources of funds. I just wanted you to know that we think we've exhausted the list, but if you have other ideas, please let us know. I wanted to stop before our discussion just talking about what's the cost of kicking the can down the road, because that's what's been pretty popular over the last few years on both of these. First year project inflation costs is Steve mentioned earlier and Scott mentions 2.5%. That's about $6.8 million a year. And as Scott mentioned, that $6.8 million gets compounded every year. So the next year it would be more than 6.8, the following year would be more, and so forth. The first year continued deterioration of Museum Center is $3.4 million, and again, that gets compounded every year. I think most of us feel that there's probably going to be an increase in interest rates, which will affect the cost. And then there's an issue that Steve Leeper did not have time to talk about. The music hall residents organizations are already counting on basically vacating music hall for a year, and they've already put that in some of their contracts, so they're counting on the timing of this happening as we've discussed it. Obviously, not approving some kind of levy or some other way of coming up with the funds and kicking the can down the road another year will obviously affect our ability to raise funds and do other things. So that's the framework, that's the context. What I'd like to do now is really engender a discussion. This is all, I'm sure, many new information to you. I'd like to get your point of view, your suggestions, and particularly your thoughts on what we need to do to understand these different sources of funds. And if you have any expertise and can help, please let us know as we think about the next steps. So some discussion, please. Jim, you had some thoughts on the political aspect. Now I'll give the microphone to Shiloh. Jim, when you're done.
Well, just a couple questions on the operating levy. When do we need to make a decision on that?
I've met with the county commissioners, and basically what I said was, you know, I think the public would have difficulty with an operating levy and a capital levy at the same time. The commissioners obviously would like to eliminate the operating levy altogether. But if we're going to get the capital levy done, let's say in November, then you would have to accelerate the operating levy to May, which a decision would have to be made by the commissioners in February. I think I'm about right with that, right, John? About right. But that becomes a very, obviously, a political decision.
If you go forward with the operating levy, do you suggest in whatever public relations campaign you have that you are ultimately going to go forward and put on the ballot the capital improvement levy?
I think what we'd like to do coming out of this group is have the credibility of this group and the diversity of this group representing the community provide credibility to the numbers that we came up with and the approach that we came up with. So I think that would have to be part of a public campaign to provide support for whatever political entity, the city or the county, that is willing to move forward. My point of view is pretty simple, which is we've worked hard on this. We think we've got some good numbers. We think we've got the right scope. Let's let the voters decide. But let's work that number down the best we can with private philanthropy, corporate philanthropy, and all the grants and so forth that are potentially available.
Murray and I were talking a little bit in the back. We could get all the lobbyists and we could do our own lobbying, but you really need a terrific public relations campaign and firm to help sell this the right way.
No question about it. No question about it. Shyla?
Yeah, mine is actually more of a context question. We've heard a lot today about this and what's on the table here, but I would like to know, and Ann might know this or others in the room, what else is on the ballot for consideration by the voters in the May primary and in the November election that will, from a voter's perspective, be perceived as additional asks or at least renewals? Does anyone have that information readily available?
I don't have, Ann probably has visibility on that. I don't have it. One thing I can tell you is when I talk to the county commissioners, they're expecting a relatively low turnout in May because, you know, it's November is when people vote for president and stuff like that, not this November, but so they're expecting a relatively low turnout in May.
For the November, probably indigent care, possibly, which would be a countywide levy, possibly a city-focused, some sort of tax for universal preschool. There'll be gubernatorial races, all the statewide races will be up. Cincinnati Public School levy, there could be other school levies as well. And then in May, there will be a family services levy and possibly this as well, the operating.
If I could add to that, the Hamilton County has, I think, close to 8 countywide levies totaling about $340 million a year. The biggest one, developmental disabilities, is this May. I don't think family's going to make it the advance to May. I think family treatment services is going to move to the fall with indigent care. And I don't know about the city. And obviously we have a commissioner election in November as well.
Yeah, Marie.
So my understanding on the operating levies, we're talking $3.5 million, somewhere in that range. And
yes, and I think it's a continuation rather than a new levy.
So I'm wondering a little bit what the cost is of going on the ballot in May, and then from a PR point of view, sort of a follow-on to what Jim said, whether or not there's been any consideration of alternative sources that we might be able to come up with that might engender some positive feeling in the voters to say, hey, they got their skin in the game, maybe we ought to put our skin in the game, not dissimilar to the way the streetcar came down?
Yeah. I think those are both good ideas. Relative to the skin in the game, I think it would be helpful if members of the task force would be willing to volunteer to work on some of these sources of funding. I'm not an expert in any of them, frankly, but if you could look at that list in front of you, and if there's something where you have expertise and could help, I think we could create some sub-teams that could work on sources of funding that would help us come back with some potential numbers. For example, I was talking to Tim. I know Tim knows a lot about private philanthropy, of course, given what he does. And he might be able to help us then develop some thoughts on how much could we get from private philanthropy with a great campaign. If others of you have that kind of expertise, or even if you don't, we would appreciate you working as well, because we need help to sort out all these different ways of funding. Because we need to come up with some numbers, and I think that would demonstrate, if we can come up with those numbers, that would demonstrate the skin in the game, and I think would be important, both for the politicians and for the public in general. So I'm ready to take names, or I can assign roles, but if you'd like to volunteer, that would be very helpful.
Bob, if I can backtrack,
yes,
just
Christian.
the election schedule, just to tuck it back in people's minds. You know, the known dates are May and November, but there are also opportunities for special elections, and I believe those are April time or August time frame. And I heard the discussion about possibly wanting to advance things. I would think, given the size of this and the importance to the community, it might be something to consider as a standalone item in a special election. Now, there are pluses and minuses of that, and I'll let the experts figure that out, but standing alone is an option as well.
Let's capture that, Chris, potential standalone. Any of you, yes, please, Bernadette.
I guess just as a caveat to what Christian was saying is, I guess with the May, talking about the May primary, you mentioned how low the turnout is, and I guess it's according to how we identify who those people are who would be responsive. If there is a standalone, especially for a cultural project on its own, I don't see that kind of turnout that may possibly be more beneficial during a primary or the general election in November.
Marie, you had another point that I didn't address, I think. Your first point was making sure you get people with skin in the game. You get, and then you had another point as well, I thought. Yeah, the cost of going on the ballot. I have no idea. Christian probably does.
The average countywide levy is about $180,000 if it's bundled with a normal November election. If it stands alone, it could be upwards of $800,000, $900,000.
Thank you, Christian.
That's board election costs. Yes, I wasn't talking about the campaign aspect. I have seen campaigns, I'm going back to the old jail campaigns, that can run upwards of $300,000 to $600,000 just in campaign work.
Yeah, but
for my edification, can you quantify of the 275 million, all these other sources, can you quantify what the Hamilton County number might be, what we might think that would be?
Again, I don't have expertise in this. Beth, do you? How much do you think we can get from, we can try to build it, how much do you think we can get from private philanthropy? 80? 80 across both projects for private? How about tax credits? Doug, we did some work on tax credits. What did we come up with about?
It's 20%.
Wait.
So historic tax credits are 20% of the project cost on Union Terminal. On Music Hall, I think that the historic tax credits, and somebody here might know for sure, but I think it's applicable against the historic parts of the building. So I thought I saw some numbers earlier that indicated that historic tax credits wouldn't count against the entire construction cost of Music Hall. I don't know if you know that, Steve, or not.
I think it's actually,
I believe you could get the full credit for the 20%.
Because it's changed from when it was 160 million, that's right. And now it's back to, okay. So that would mean you'd have 50, if you're at 170 million, you're 34 million there, then you're at 20 million, so 54 million from historic tax credits.
54 of tax credits. 80 of private philanthropy. Do I hear one? No, I feel like a barker, right?
Bob, if I could add the...
So that's 134.
Yeah,
Christian?
Something to consider is the sequencing of the cash inflow and then the ultimate impact on the taxpayer. And I'll just use an example of, say, a sales tax versus a property tax. You do a 30-year property tax, the total project cost ends up $500 million. With debt service, you do a 5-year sales tax, total project cost is maybe $320 million. You pay it off a lot sooner. The higher the public or the private input, if that's cash and it's in the first few years, it has a dramatic impact of what you're asking for the taxpayers, even if it's a 30-year bond,
Right.
because you're paying the cash up front. And whoever's modeling this can have a real impact on bringing down the actual ask of the public because there's a lot of cash up front.
Right. Who's good at that kind of thing? Anybody volunteer? I need help. Yeah, John.
Can you do a sales tax issue that is limited in duration? Can you say we're going to propose a 5-year sales tax only?
Yes and no. You're relying on the promises of an elected body. I don't. I think you would want to legislate that if you wanted to, go through the state on that and get a hard legislative one. Some of the other things we've talked about, as far as governance structures, if you hard legislated it through the state, yes, it would be definitive. But under current law, I don't think you can guarantee it, but you can say it.
Other thoughts? So I think we're up to about 150 or so versus the, about 279 or so? Yes, Steve?
The 20% for historic tax credits would be the gross, and then there's the net that needs to come out of that. So you're probably netting something like 70% of that. Right.
Other thoughts? Help. Yeah, John. We love you.
Not to beat a dead horse about the pop of the building that when you first walk in the door. I think it was mentioned in the music hall discussion as well. I think somehow it'd be great to value engineer some additional funds out of the museum center costs so that on the day of opening, that exhibits aren't just refreshed, that we have that new science exhibit that the public can see and we can market that to the public. And I think you were talking about, your associate at P&G was talking about the ability to increase the cost of attendance with that additional kind of exhibit space. So I would love to see some of the construction budget reduced somehow and have that new exhibit space in there on day one.
Good. I think with what we did, we've got the space, and I think we have some of the money, but probably not enough money for the new exhibits and what they would cost. And then increased revenue would be a big help.
What I'd say, I think if we can figure out how to get this project going, what I believe will happen is it's going to stimulate a lot of interest, and people are going to be interested in those things. And for instance, we've got a donor who has been, we're not going to talk about it, some people know who this is, but we've got a donor who has been talking about giving us a 7-figure gift for a new history exhibit, and just kind of want to do this. But I have thought about this, and I thought, if I went to the donor and said, okay, now I really want a hard commitment from you on that 7-figure gift, and we want to go through, and this is what we want to do. I mean, I think there's probably other opportunities that people probably wouldn't give to other projects. You could go to them and say, there's really are things we could do to leverage and make it happen. And of course, I'm a museum guy, so I'm highly motivated to do that. I just know the building has to happen first and do the rest of it. I want to do all the rest of it. We just want to, and I do think we can absolutely have that, and we should have it.
Yeah, we've got to. I mean, it's got to be a different experience than what people would have had beforehand. Yes, Bernadette.
I guess you talk about the public relations campaign and what we're doing, and all of the people, I guess, around the table on the committee have had the opportunity to feel the excitement of the tour and how we feel. And I think what's important is in so many communities, I don't think that enthusiasm is there about the facility, and as you do the public relations campaign, to not just make people aware, but as I always say, to engage them in what we're doing so they'll have a clear understanding, and then that way you encourage. You talk about getting people to vote for the levy and, you know, the public aspect of it. So I think that's really important.
Good. Well, this is the work that needs to be done. And I'd love to have some volunteers to be helping to do it. Thank you, Tim. If you could take the private piece, that would be terrific. I'd love some help on the public piece because I don't have any expertise in this at all. Anyone? Bernadette, thank you very much. And the historic tax credits, I think we can work with the people at 3CDC who have that experience. Is that not the case? Doug?
That'd be great. They'll need some consulting.
They've done a lot of work. Yeah. Robert, you've got a lot of experience with that.
Well, they'll need some consulting help because I think what was stated before, you get the credit, then you have to sell it.
Yeah.
And the investor's looking for a return, so you have to do that. And then, I mean, we're making assumptions around certainly new markets, but we have to make sure the space or the location is eligible, and I'm assuming it is, but same with Music Hall, but with the demographics changing in those neighborhoods, new markets is not a foregone conclusion. Plus, we'll have to assemble a lot of new market tax credit allocation to get a reasonable amount. So, but I'm willing to work on that, but there's a lot of assumptions that have to be made with the tax credits, yeah.
Right. There's a lot of, I'm sorry, Jim?
We have people working on a campaign strategy as we speak? Okay.
Yes.
I think also it's important that we keep the momentum going that we're starting to see in the press. I've gotten a lot of questions from the media wanting to talk about this, and we've pushed them all off because as I said at the beginning, what we don't want is a number to leave this room and suddenly that number gets locked in concrete. We're able to lower that number, and it's hard to get lowered publicly because it's already leaked the room. So while we did one interview with the announcement of the task force, what we thought we would do today, with your approval, is to release the names of the task force members. If you don't want your name on that list, please let Beth know. Because we thought we'd do today is just release the names of the task force and say that we've met, but not talk about any details. And wait until we get further down the road to talk those details. But I think it's important we keep that public momentum going until we have this thing fully put together. Any other questions or comments? Yes, Jim.
What about the public relations aspect of it, which I think is all important? Do we have somebody thought out that's working on that?
Yes, but
I mean, Bob has leveraged lots of resources in that regard from lots of pockets throughout the city, and so there have been people looking at that in terms of a strategic communications plan. I mean, you can speak to me about it. So.
Well, we Mabe, for example, is on loan from Procter & Gamble and has been doing the marketing work for the museum center. I think we'll have lots of opportunity as we pull this together to have public relations firms and marketing firms within the community be willing to do this with us. What we really need, I mean, what you've seen here is a few weeks of work to get the engineering numbers about right. What we really need now is what are the other sources of funds that we can come up with to lower that number. And then we need people with the skills and knowledge of how the politics work to decide what the best way to do it is. Is it a sales tax? Is it a levy? Is it a special levy and or is it an operating levy and a capital levy and that? And that's the work we need to do. I suggest we, does anybody have any other comments? Robert? I'm sorry, Kathy?
I'm really interested in the public relations and the campaign strategy, but also determining exactly what it is we're asking for. So if that's in campaign strategy and public relations and engagement, I'd like to work in that area.
Good, good.
But also very interested in how we come up with that final, what is that ask?
Yes.
Bob, I think Bernadette alluded to this earlier. I think in addition to simply a public relations strategy, that a major component of it has to be engagement and education, because these are exceptional resources, don't exist everywhere, and I think they're underappreciated. Not because people, have an automatic response to be opposed to, but if they really understand the significance of these resources, understand more of the inner workings of them, that they will be more inclined to want to see them protected. So we just can't, go on TV with a lot of good marketing, which is good, we got to do that.
Yeah.
But we have to engage them, and we
Grassroots.
have to get community leaders to do tours of some of these facilities, discuss a lot of the collateral benefits that are always aware to the public, and that we can, if not make many of those community leaders advocates, at least neutralize any opposition that might be there.
Bob, I had one thought.
Yeah, Tim.
We need ArtsWave to be on this train with us. We need virtually every arts organization in the city to publicly support this. That's a learning we had from some other cities that have gone through this type of maneuver. I think the work of our foundation can help jumpstart and certainly can contribute to the PR campaign. We'll shape luminosity around this. We're looking for a way to illuminate this building in a different way, but we can help with connections on some of those public events that we plan to support.
That's great. That's great. Yes, Wick.
Doug, this is kind of a side issue, but I don't know how people find out you're on the task team before you announce the names, but people do. And so I've had several people come up to me and say, well, what do you need to do that at the museum center for? Because there's not that many people that visit that place anymore. And I said, well, I heard it's one of the most visited places in the country for a museum. So when you think about a public relations camp, these were not uninformed people, but they were shocked when I said that this is one of the more successful museums in the United States. So I think there is an opportunity there to re-educate the public on just how valuable this is to our community.
So the talk point for all of us is, Forbes said we're the 17th most highly attended museum in the United States. 12 of the 17 ahead of us are free, which include mostly Smithsonian institutions in Washington, D.C., plus the Metropolitan New York, plus Houston has one museum ahead of us, and Chicago, where we're about 200,000 behind the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. 200,000 behind the field. The science industry is higher than that. So it is a, yeah. You just gave Elizabeth here, who does our marketing, you just gave her hives, but anyway, other than that.
Well, and we're one of what, maybe 3 communities in the country with a fine arts fund, or with an ArtsWave fund. How many communities have a ballet, an opera, a symphony, a music hall, an art museum, and they're our size? I mean, you're right, Wick, we've got to get the word out. These things don't happen by chance.
I would just say, for our part, we need to, and put as a task, to continue to pursue aggressively cost reductions on the scope. I mean, it was up there as one of Scott's recommendations. I mean, he has a set of recommendations that we haven't really folded some of those forward, but I think we need to show good faith and pursue those cost reductions as aggressively as possible. because that would allow to actually give a different reduced number to the commissioners before you would get to a July timeframe when you'd be looking at something. July is when you have to have the information to the commissioners on what goes on in the fall. So if these levies shuffled, then in July you need to have a hard number for the fall, and so you'd have time to actually pursue this and see if you can reduce the number further.
I was wondering, for the May ballot, for something to be on the May ballot, when does that have to occur for it to show on the May ballot? Does anyone know?
February, right? February 5th.
For November, it's last week of July.
Somebody else, Amy, I think you had a hand up.
I have a question. We've been talking a lot about sort of campaign strategy, and I don't know much about working with the campaign. So my question is, if I remember my numbers right, we were looking at 170-ish million for the terminal, and that included the recommendation to accelerate the design phase to save $4.2 million. Is there any concern, should there be any concern, about getting ahead of the voters on design? Because that would require starting design before a capital levy was approved.
This is my point of view, but you all can disagree with me. For me, it wouldn't be as much getting ahead of the voters, because I know where the voters are from the CBC survey. It'd be getting ahead of the politicians, because I have to go through the gate of the politicians before I can get to the voters.
Okay.
And I don't want to get ahead of the politicians, because if they refuse to give the voters a chance to vote, then that person, those people, those corporations or whoever that spent the money on the design just wasted the money.
Okay. And
Anybody see it differently? I'm happy to entertain different ideas. I'm sorry, you want to say something?
One other thing to note is a lot of times designs are started early in the process before all the funds and approvals are put in place. Like, just to use our partners in Music Hall as an example, the design has started on that project and there has been design done. So the fact that we're starting this process this early on is a great thing, but design does move forward, because as you saw, if it doesn't, there's that gap in time that really delays the project.
Yeah, Marie.
So I'm happy to volunteer to help with funding mechanisms, and our firm in particular has expertise, as I know some other people do, in new market tax credits. But as a subset of private philanthropy, we need to identify naming rights and the value. I know that's been a little bit of a subject in the paper, and I did notice there are 2 McDonald's in the room, so a McDonald Union Terminal for $50 million would be really helpful.
Thank you, Murray. That's a great idea. I think as a task force, we should assign naming rights to Doug and Scott, right? I mean, aren't you the best ones to do that? So could you do that, please? Okay, Murray's, let's call the question. Let's get to the close. So Murray's going to help us do funding. You said there were other people in the room with expertise. Would you like to name your committee?
I'll take that under advisement.
Take that under advisement. Do they know who they are?
Probably not.
Expect a phone call from Murray, and please say yes.
One other item.
Yeah, John.
The standalone levy vote is up there, is the item that Christian mentioned. The cost to market a levy in November, just from advertising, is much more expensive than it is in
May.
Any other time. So somebody should spend a little time evaluating what the cost is to market the levy and adding the special dollars of having a vote
right
in the summertime or whatever, besides the cost of doing it in November.
Right. November's more expensive than May. That's why I got that.
Something to consider that's slightly off of this here is the long term for the 2 buildings. We're here today because they weren't taken care of.
Yes.
So there's no guarantee or expectation that the public parties will not, that these buildings get to where they're at today 30 years from now. So ownership and governance for the future maintenance of these buildings might be something to consider in the overall project.
Yeah. I'm happy to work that. Obviously, that would involve the mayor and the county commissioners, right? And I'm really open to your ideas. Give me something to sell. Tell me what we should sell, because you're right. I mean, the divided ownership of the building is. Plus, you add for this building, you add the bridge to it, or the street, and you have another complication.
Of course, anything I say in this room does not reflect the opinion or position of the Hamilton County
No, you're here as a
Commissioners.
private citizen.
Just a technical advisor. If you go back to the stadiums, there was an option in the mid-'90s to create a stadium authority. And powers that be at the time, I wasn't even in Ohio, but the powers that be at the time said, no, the county owned the stadiums. So when things went bad, it was on our books. This issue of these buildings and historic, cultural facilities and that type of thing have been kicked around as spinning them off into an authority structure similar to the convention center. It's Convention Facilities Authority, and they issued the bonds, and the city and county partnered on that. It's not on my books, it's not on the city's books, and if the thing goes bad, it's on the CFA, it's not on the policy
I think
bodies.
Pittsburgh has that, don't they?
Pittsburgh has a similar thing with their cultural assets, if you will. I think there's some value to that because the stadium issue is so raw in this community's eyes. Having it outside of the policy bodies for a long period of time might give some credibility to the overall effort, saying, oh, so it's not going to be this body or that body, are going to make sure this, and actually pulling off the project.
Yeah.
Cost overruns, delays, and that type of thing. Having it outside of the cloud of a public body or public entity could help in the near term and the long term.
Who's an expert? I mean, who could? I guess Steve could help us. Steve Leeper could help us there because he was the head of the. Wasn't he the head of the Sports Authority of Pittsburgh, Sports and Exhibition Authority in Pittsburgh?
Yeah, and there's some folks in town that have looked at this, other outside the government, bond councils and that type of thing. How would you structure that? How would you get the state approval on that? So
Do you have a name, Christian?
I'll give it to you offline.
Okay.
All right.
Well, I'm thinking if somebody here knows that person, they can ask. I can ask the person too, but they could help us ask the person too. So let me know that.
Just to piggyback on that one of the recommendations of TLRC, Doug reminded me, was that that if a levy went forward, that this building should be put in separate ownership to clarify any disputes between the city and the county, and also try to take a little bit of the politics out of things.
Right. Murray?
I've been involved in a number of capital campaigns, and it seems to me like the state of the art anymore is when you ask somebody for, pick a number, $1 million, that money is divided between the actual capital expenditure and an endowment to maintain. And I don't know if we've given any consideration to that, and I've seen campaigns at 90-10, 80-20, but 100-0 doesn't sell so well.
Yeah, that's a good thought. We'll capture that thought. So, yes, I have.
Mayor and Fountain.
I have. Well, they were all non-committal, and basically what I wanted to do is give them confidence about the process that we're following and the rigor that we're following, and also encourage them that now was the time to stop kicking the can, whatever that final proposal became. Yeah, I think that would help, Jim. I think, continuing to say that we've got to do something, and it just doesn't help to kick the can down the road and say, not on my watch. Yes? Kay? Oh, thank you, Kay. Did you get that, Chris? That's helpful, Kay. Thank you so much. Would those of you who haven't yet volunteered for a specific committee, would you please do that? And maybe by telling the person who already has or telling me which one you'd like to be on. And if you don't want to do that, I'll be happy to call you and see if I can persuade you, because that would be very helpful. Yes, Francie. Thank you, Francie. Francie's going to do private philanthropy with Tim. Okay, and we'll put Scott Farmer down there as well. GCF will help, of course, yeah. That's great. That's a super group. On the public relations and engagement campaign, Mabe, I assume you would want to be involved in that, given your marketing expertise. Mabe got an award from the President of Columbia for her leadership of Procter & Gamble Columbia. That was pretty impressive. Yeah. Anybody else want to be part of the public relations and engagement work with Kathy and Bernadette and Robert? Okay, we'll add Robert there. This is great. Thank you. Thank you, Liza. I saw one other hand. Okay, Murray and Kay, you want to create a merger? We had Messer and Turner do it, so I mean, you know, that would be terrific. Yeah, because we don't have a whole lot of people. Okay, good. So we'll merge those two together. Naming rights we got covered. Are there any other subcommittees that we need? Anything we're missing? I will continue the meeting with the county commissioners and the mayor to let them know what we're doing. And I'll also continue on I will be present for all of these committee meetings as well. And we're going to put together a strategy of releasing information at appropriate times to help us with the public. Are we missing anything? Scott, Doug, are we missing anything? I think our next meeting, if I'd like to suggest February 18th, Tuesday, February 18th. I'm going to be out of town. Actually, I'm going to Arizona for Reds Fantasy Camp, so I'm looking forward to that with my son. But let's see if we can shoot for Tuesday, February 18th. Let's try to get as much work as we can get done in the sub-teams, in the subcommittees before then, and look at that meeting as a way to report on what we've got. And also, let's try to get that information shared with each other ahead of time. I'm sorry, John.
It feels like the effort to continue to reduce costs should have some representation from the task force.
Yep. I'm there. I'm sure Wick is there because Wick's an architect, and we can use in Bob. Bob can help us there. And John, you'll help us as well. Yeah, because those projects are going on. What would be best for you? Nothing? Yeah, thank you, Wick. How about, what's a good time on the 18th? Miss rush hour, like 10? Is that good? Is that good? 10 o'clock here in this room? Is that okay? Doug, is that okay? Okay, 10 o'clock here in this room on the 18th. Well, I'd like to thank, I think we're done, but I'd like to thank everybody for their willingness to do this. I really do think it's important, and I know you all do too, and it's so important for our community to come together behind this project and get something done. Just get something done so we aren't guilty of kicking the can down the road further. So thank you very much. Have a great weekend, and thanks for being here. Thank you.